Good afternoon. The first item of business this afternoon is consideration of Business Motion 8768 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a timetable for the Stage 3 consideration of the Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill. Could I ask any member who wishes to speak against this motion to press the request to speak button now, please? No member has asked to speak against the motion. Therefore, I will now put the question. I will first of all ask the Minister to move motion number 8768. Minister.
Moves, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Now, since no member has asked to speak against the motion, I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 8768, in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business this afternoon, then, is Stage 3 proceedings on the Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill. In dealing with the amendments, members should have the bill as amended at Stage 2, that is SP Bill 26A, the marshalled list, that is SP Bill 26A ML, and the groupings SP Bill 26A to G. The division bell will sound and proceedings will be suspended for 5 minutes for the first division of the afternoon. The period of voting for the first division will then be 30 seconds. Thereafter, I will allow a voting period of 1 minute for the first division after each debate. Members who wish to speak in the debate on any group of amendments should press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible after I call that particular group. And members should now refer, please, to the marshalled list of amendments. And on that list, you will see that we now turn to Group 1, Sustainable Economic Growth and Sustainable Development. And I call Amendment 15 in the name of Alison Johnson, which is grouped with Amendments 16 to 22. And I point out that if Amendment 17 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 18. And if Amendment 20 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 21 due to preemptions. I now ask Alison Johnson to move Amendment 15 and to speak to all amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The subject of my amendments has formed a substantial part of the debate around this bill, and the phrase sustainable economic growth has never appeared in primary legislation before, so I hope that the Government welcomes the scrutiny here. The amendments in this group are in 2 sets. My preferred set of amendments are those which would remove from the bill the Section 4 duty on regulators and references to sustainable economic growth in the Regulators Code of Practice and CEPA's purpose. Those are 16, 17 and 20. Amendments 19 and 22 are related to these changes but consequential. Why do I believe the Section 4 duty should be removed and the references to sustainable economic growth deleted? Sustainable economic growth is the Government's stated purpose, and they have every right to promote their policy priorities. But I fail to see the link the Minister claims there is between the proposed duty and delivering the policy intention of regulatory consistency. No one denies that Scotland is a good place in which to do business. The Scottish Trades Union Congress made the point in its evidence that we are not living in an overly regulated world. Scottish regulators are willingly engaged with the Regulatory Review Group, and good progress is being made on consistency in non-legislative ways. We've heard no real practical examples from the Government of how the duty will work. Many of the regulators, in fact, told us they had no objection to the duty because they were already doing it. They were already contributing to the Government's purpose. And if that is the case, why must we add unnecessary complications with legislation that isn't needed and new duties when collaborative initiatives are already working? The other set of amendments, that is 15, 18 and 21, don't delete sections or paragraphs, but replace the bill's references to sustainable economic growth in the regulator's duty, the Code of Practice and CEPA's purpose with sustainable development. These aren't my preferred amendments, but I've lodged them in the hope that should members wish to retain the Section 4 duty, they'll be able to support referring to a concept in law which explicitly balances social, environmental and economic considerations. Sustainable development is well recognised, which addresses the concerns from many, including the Law Society of Scotland, that any new concept in law will be open to the courts to define and may cause confusion about what should and shouldn't be considered in any decision-making. Additional concerns were raised at Stage 2 that sustainable development does not in practice balance its 3 pillars, but rather focuses on the environmental, This, I suggest, is more as a result of being applied in places where the environment was previously overlooked. Now, no one wants regulators to act inefficiently or in overly complicated ways, but they are generally doing a very good job, and the Regulatory Review Group reports it is making good progress on consistency in non-legislative ways. Of course, there are always improvements to be made, especially to support small businesses, but the rest of this bill will provide the government with other powers in relation to national standards and consistency, and I fail to see how the Section 4 duty and other references to contributing to sustainable economic growth will connect with the policy objective of regulatory consistency. I move Amendment 15.
Many thanks. I have members who wish to contribute to this section. If I could ask them to be as brief as possible. Gavin Brown, to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think the Scottish Government have called it right on this particular issue. I think the scrutiny has been useful in that it tightens up some of the guidance and code of practice that will follow, but on the principal issue, I support what they're doing. It's something that my party has approved of for quite some time. The arguments against it in principle, I find myself disagreeing with. I think this will place a duty, by placing a duty, it raises the profile of the issue. It provides, I think, a vision and creates a change in culture. And I think it also protects the primary role of each regulator by giving a clear exception where there is a conflict, as under Section 4, subsection 1. So it doesn't override their primary duties, but I think it quite rightly places a new duty on them that has to be taken into consideration. The arguments against definition, I think, have been countered by the Government, making it clear that there will be a full definition, both in guidance and indeed in a code of practice. And I was comforted too by the idea that the EET committee would be having an oversight and involvement here as well. I note in passing that Oscar, in their written submission to the EET committee, did state that they already support on sustainable economic growth as required by Section 31(1) of the Public Services Scotland Act 2010. It should actually be Section 32 of the Public Services Reform Scotland Act, but nevertheless, I think the fact that they were able to overcome definitional challenges there leads me to believe we'll be able to do the same here, and on that basis, we will not be supporting these amendments.
Thank you. Malcolm Chisholm.
I'm told there has been some progress on this since we discussed it at stage 1, so I will be very interested to hear what the Minister has to say about it. But I have to say that when I did read the Economy Committee report and the Rural Affairs Committee report on the bill, I was struck by the range of bodies who were expressing concerns about this. Partly, yes, it was some of the environmental groups where we might expect it, but there was also a much broader range of bodies, the STUC, for example, and even some business organisations were sceptical about it. So I'm genuinely puzzled why this phrase, which we know, of course, is central to the government's purpose, but why it should be introduced into legislation at the for the first time. In fact, I recall one academic saying in the evidence that it was ambiguous and that some people might even take it to mean growth that was economically sustainable, which I think is not the intention of the government's wording. So there is ambiguity around it and therefore a lack of clarity. So I'll be very interested to hear the Minister's response, but I do think Alison Johnson's second set of proposals around sustainable development would be a much more sensible and consistent approach to take, because it already exists in legislation. For example, I remember debates about this during the planning bill. So the idea of balancing out economic considerations with economic considerations is established, and the concept of sustainable development is well established in law. So as I've indicated at the beginning, I believe there has been progress, so I will listen with an open mind, but I am still concerned about this. I'm very struck by the wide range of evidence. And my last point is I remember the Rural Affairs Committee saying there should be a definition on the face of the bill, and given the ambiguity of the term, I'll also be interested in hearing an explanation of why that suggestion from the Rural Affairs Committee has not been taken up.
Thank you very much. And I now call the Minister, Fergus Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful to members for contributing to this debate this afternoon, as members have contributed to debating this issue at stage 1 and also stage 2. The amendments this afternoon are, I understand it, word for word identical to those that are previously submitted, and we have debated this before, but I am grateful for the contributions that members have made. Sustainable economic growth is an essential component of the Scottish Government's purpose. We are determined to promote in all Scottish regulators a broad and deep alignment to this. The Sustainable Economic Growth duty in the Bill provides an important line of sight to the Government's purpose. It will first complement existing duties, it will increase transparency, encourage greater regulatory consistency and encourage more engagement and joined-up working. Many regulators, as has been referred to, already contribute to sustainable economic growth in their day-to-day activities. The current wording of the duty within the bill seeks to build on that to support and empower regulators to contribute to the Government's purpose, making them more accountable for the decisions that they make. The Scottish Government and regulators in Scotland value both sustainable economic growth and the protection of the environment. They need not be mutually exclusive. The duty does not prioritise sustainable economic growth over other regulatory objectives. Regulators need to determine an appropriate balance between regulatory and economic objectives, and the Code of Practice will help them do that. The duty is underpinned by the Code of Practice, which will build on and encourage best practice and support regulators delivering the duty to contribute to achieving sustainable economic growth. Regulators have signalled that they already act in this way, Presiding Officer. The duty will support and build on this, helping protect our people, our environment and help business to flourish and create jobs. We are firmly committed to promoting sustainable economic growth and to the current provisions within the bill. Sustainable development is an integral part of sustainable economic growth, and therefore the Scottish Government does not support these amendments.
Thank you very much. I now give Alison Johnson the opportunity to respond and indicate whether you are going to press or withdraw, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Gavin Brown stated that the proposal would highlight the issue of economic growth. Well, I think it's fair to say that economic growth already has a very high profile, and regulators do currently contribute to sustainable economic growth. There is no need to include it in this legislation. I disagree with Gavin Brown that the bill will clarify in cases of conflict. It is my view and the view of others, including Environment Link, the STUC, Consumer Focus Scotland, that this bill actually introduces a conflict that doesn't currently exist. Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee believes that the duty would confuse regulators. And Environment Link have said we fear the greatest risk remains the unintended consequences of this move on our legal system, amounting to a lawyer's charter instead of assisting with practical decision-making and streamlining regulation. I do welcome the fact that ministers have already removed the duty from the planning system. It's fair to say that there are well-documented instances where the economy has trumped the environment when it comes to planning, and I'm very concerned that this duty will make it more difficult to implement truly balanced regulation. The Scottish Government's proposal, as Malcolm Chisholm mentioned, has united some incredibly diverse groups in concern and opposition. Those include Oxfam, the Law Society of Scotland, the STUC, Scottish Environment Link and the Association of Salmon Fishery Boards, to name but a few. The fundamental question here isn't about definitions, because we understand the general thrust of what's meant by sustainable economic growth, but it's about whether it's right to place such an economic duty on regulators in the first place. Regulators help to stop the tiny minority of people who cheat or deceive and thereby gain economic advantage over businesses that play by the rules. That is how regulators help our economy to operate smoothly. They enable a fair, competitive environment in which business can develop, and they should be allowed to focus entirely on that main purpose. I move the amendment.
Thank you very much. The question then is that Amendment 15 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division. Since this is the first division of the stage, the Parliament is now suspended for 5 minutes. We will now proceed with the division on Amendment 15. This is a 30-second division, and I would be grateful if members could cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 15 is as follows. Yes, 26, no 71. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. I now call amendment 16 in the name of Alison Johnston, which has already been debated with amendment 15, and I ask Alison Johnston to move or not move.
Move.
The member has moved the amendment. The question therefore is that amendment 16 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division. This is a 30-second division. Please vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 16 is as follows. Yes, 28, no 71. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. I now call amendment 17 in the name of Alison Johnston, which has already been debated with amendment 15, and I remind members that if amendment 17 is agreed to, then I cannot call amendment 18 as it would be pre-empted. And I ask Alison Johnston to move or not move amendment 17.
Move.
Thank you. The question then is that amendment 17 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division. This will be a 30-second division. Please vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 17 is as follows. Yes, 28, no 71. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I now call amendment 18 in the name of Alison Johnston, which has already been debated with amendment 15, and I ask Alison Johnston to move or not move.
Move.
The amendment has been moved. The question then is that amendment... Order, please. The question is that amendment 18 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division. This is a 30-second division. Please vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 18 is yes, 28, no 71. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. I now call amendment 19 in the name of Alison Johnston, already debated with amendment 15, and I ask Alison Johnston to move or not move.
Not move.
The amendment has not been moved, and therefore that brings us to Group 2, minor and technical. And I call Amendment 2 in the name of the Minister, Paul Wheelhouse, which is grouped with Amendments 3 and 9. And I ask the Minister to move Amendment 2 and to speak to all amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Amendment 2 is a minor technical amendment, correcting a referencing error in the text of the bill as introduced. Amendment 3 is needed because SEPA will certify non-compliance with an enforcement undertaking under regulations made using the new powers in Section 19 of the bill, rather than directly under that section. And during Stage 2 of the bill, new provisions were agreed which provide a broad legal framework for primary authority in Scotland. Primary authority will deliver improved consistency of regulation and reduce duplication. Amendment 9 includes a reference to primary authorities in the long title of the bill to ensure it fully reflects the contents. I move Amendment 2.
Many thanks, and I can offer the opportunity to Minister Fergus Ewing to speak to Amendment 9 if he so wishes. The Minister does not wish. Minister Paul Wheelhouse, would you wish to add anything else?
No, thank you.
Thank you very much. In which case, we turn to the question, and the question is that Amendment 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is agreed. I now call Amendment 3 in the name of the Minister, Paul Wheelhouse, which has already been debated with Amendment 2, and I ask the Minister to formally move.
Formally moved.
Many thanks. The question is that Amendment 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is agreed. That then brings us to Group 3, offences relating to supply of carrier bags, fixed penalty notices. And I call Amendment 1 in the name of Murdo Fraser, which is in a group on its own, and I ask Murdo Fraser to move and speak to Amendment 1.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. At Stage 2 of this bill, the Scottish Government introduced an amendment which brought in Section 32B. This amends the Climate Change Scotland Act 2009 to allow for the provision of fixed penalty notices for contraventions and non-compliance with forthcoming carrier bag regulations. My amendment today seeks to delete Section 32B and therefore to reverse the decision taken at Stage 2. I have two reasons for opposing the amendment today. The first relates to the substantive issue. On that point of principle, the Scottish Conservatives do not support the proposed plastic bag tax. There are some very good detailed arguments against this proposal set out in the briefing for this debate provided by the Scottish Retail Consortium. Now, I have always believed we should only be introducing legislation and taxes to change behaviour.
Mr Fraser, could I start you for a moment? Can I have some order, please? If members wish to contribute to this debate, could they please press the request to speak buttons and they will be called to contribute. Mr Fraser.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I have always believed we should only be introducing legislation or taxes to change behaviour as a last resort. I do not believe such an approach is necessary in this case. Already a voluntary approach by many retailers has substantially reduced the volume of plastic bags being issued. And the British Retail Consortium have noted there has already been a 50% reduction in carrier bag use in England through voluntary action agreed with the UK Government. Now, there are different views on how effective a carrier bag charge might be and how beneficial it might be to the environment. This issue was last considered in detail by this Parliament back in 2005, when the then Environment Committee considered Mike Pringle's members' bill on the issue, and unanimously, Deputy Presiding Officer, came to the view that this was not the right way to proceed. Amongst members of that committee were one Rob Gibson from the SNP and, even more interesting, one Richard Lockhead, now enjoying a position as Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs and the Environment. Oh, yes, please, Mr Gibson.
Rob Gibson.
I think that the members should be honest with the Chamber and say the reasons why the committee at that time refused this, because they were to do with them being ultra vires for the Scottish Parliament.
Murdo Fraser.
Well, that's a very interesting intervention from Mr Gibson, because I took great care to read the report in great detail. There were a whole range of very compelling arguments why this was argued against at the time. For example, the committee said there were a number of unintended consequences that would likely be connected with achieving a large reduction in plastic bag use by means of the proposed levy. They also heard evidence that a tax on plastic bags might mean an increase in other waste and no overall decline in CO2 emissions. So I'm not clear what has led Mr Lockhead and Mr Gibson and all their colleagues on the SNP benches to change their view on this matter since 2005, but no doubt the Minister will enlighten us when he comes to speak. But leaving aside the substantive issue, the second and perhaps more serious concern is in relation to the procedure being followed by the Scottish Government on this matter. As members will know, I convene the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee, and we spend a lot of time taking evidence at stage 1 on the general principles of this bill. The Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee did a very thorough piece of work as a secondary committee looking at Part 2 of the bill dealing with SEPA. Neither of our committees had the opportunity to take evidence at stage 1 on this proposal on a carrier bag tax, because it was only at the very last moment in the stage 1 debate that the Minister indicated a stage 2 amendment would be brought forward to introduce this tax. Now, I know, Deputy Presiding Officer, that the Scottish Government has consulted on the proposal, but there has been no opportunity for proper parliamentary scrutiny. And it seems to me that when we are dealing with what is an important matter, which will have a wide impact, the introduction of a new tax, it should be open to a committee of this Parliament to give that measure full scrutiny, and that was not provided in this case. And it is deeply ironic that in a bill that is about improving regulation, we are seeing a measure brought forward that has not been properly scrutinised. Presiding Officer, for these two reasons, I believe this measure should be removed from the bill before us. It opens the way to the Government, if they wish to bring it back in primary legislation, for proper scrutiny to do that at a future date. It should not be in this bill, and therefore I move this amendment in my name.
I now call on the Minister, Paul Wheelhouse.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I think after Murdo Fraser's contribution, we can be clear on one thing. The Tories support a bedroom tax, but apparently not a plastic bag tax, even though it would be said that the UK Government is proposing a similar charging structure themselves in the rest of the UK in 2015. Presiding Officer,
Order, please.
Presiding Officer, this amendment would remove powers to provide for more modest fixed monetary penalties as part of enforcement of carrier bag charging offences proposed from 20th of October. We will be working closely with Scottish retailers to help them understand their responsibilities, and coupled with a pragmatic approach from local authorities, we do not expect a significant number of cases where enforcement action will even be necessary. However, we do want to ensure that local authorities have an option which provides a realistic threat of enforcement action without the need for court action and avoiding costs for all sides. This amendment would remove that proportionate and cost-efficient enforcement option. The Scottish Government therefore cannot accept the amendment. As I explained to the EET committee, which Murdo Fraser convenes, we had proposed enforcement through civil penalties in last year's consultation on carrier bag charging. No consultees objected to this. However, it emerged in preparing the proposed regulations this summer that the enabling powers do not allow for this. We therefore put the fixed penalty provisions forward at stage 2, following discussion with COSLA and retailer representatives. COSLA strongly supports the fixed penalty option on efficiency grounds. The Scottish Grocers Federation supported the fixed penalty provisions in its recent representations on the carrier bag charging regulations. And although it would prefer no new penalties, it favoured civil sanctions over criminal penalties. It said this would give local authorities or other enforcement authorities access to a more proportionate and effective enforcement option than would otherwise exist. As to Scottish Retail Consortium's concerns, the Retail Consortium opposes fixed penalties as a matter of principle, as Murdo Fraser said. However, we believe they can provide a helpful alternative to court action for this type of offence, helping ensure a level playing field for businesses who are complying with the legislation. Section 32B sets out a fixed penalty regime in some detail, addressing most of the points the SRC has asked to be included. In particular, I would like to highlight that enforcement authorities will need to take account of guidance, which will help to ensure a consistent, proportionate approach to enforcement. Anyone receiving a fixed penalty notice could make representations to the enforcing authority if they disagree or believe it to be unfair. And thirdly, anyone who wanted to force the enforcement authority to decide whether to take the matter to court could simply do so by not paying the penalty. We note the SRC's suggestion that such fines should go to a consolidated fund. The proposed amendment would allow ministers to prescribe how any funds raised were to be applied, but would need dialogue with stakeholders before deciding whether and how to exercise that power. And we note SRC's suggestion that these provisions would be in scope of the primary authority provisions proposed for the bill. Obviously, such a move would require consultation, but this may indeed be the sort of area where a primary authority approach would be helpful. And there is already a requirement in the primary legislation for enforcement authorities to take account of guidance. Section 32B includes a similar requirement for action on fixed penalties. So why push the point that was made with Murdo Fraser about the Environment Committee and Richard Lochhead and indeed Rob Gibson's membership of it? Our carrier bag charging proposals will reduce bag use, preventing a highly visible, damaging and expensive component of litter and marine litter. And unlike the Environment Levy proposed in 2005, this charge will cover all single-use bags, not just plastic. This will prevent switching to other materials with a higher carbon impact, specifically paper. And this was a major reason why the previous bill was rejected. And we also looked in detail at the economic impacts to ensure the regulations are designed to minimise negative effects. The world has moved on, unlike the Tories perhaps, since 2005, and globally there is more appetite to tackle this issue, not least in the European Union, which is putting forward a requirement for member states to tackle single-use plastic bags. Now, I understand that might upset Murdo Fraser and his colleagues, but I just remind them that even the UK Government is proposing a charge on plastic bags in England for 2015. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Murdo Fraser to wind up as briefly as possible, please, and indicate if you intend to press or withdraw.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Well, the difference between me and the Environment Minister is some of us have some consistency on issues, unlike him and his party. I listened with great care to the explanation that he provided. I struggled to hear a single word of explanation, Deputy Presiding Officer, for why this was introduced in this way. This was such a good idea and thought of so long ago. Why was it dropped into this bill at the very last minute? Why was it not brought forward at stage 1? Why was there not the opportunity for the committees of this Parliament to scrutinise fully? No, Deputy Presiding Officer, I would appeal to the Minister, who I know is a very reasonable man. There is still the opportunity for him to change his mind on this. We can have a debate about the substance of this issue on a different occasion. This is a matter of process and respect for Parliament. Even at this late stage, let him support my amendment. Take this out of the bill, bring it back in a different piece of legislation so we can have proper parliamentary scrutiny and show respect for Parliament. I shall be pressing my amendment.
Many thanks. The question then is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division. This is a 1-minute division. Please vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 1 is as follows. Yes, 12, no, 87. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. I now call amendment 20 in the name of Alison Johnston, which has already been debated with amendment 15. And I remind members that if amendment 20 is agreed to, then I cannot call amendment 21 as it would be pre-empted. I ask Alison Johnston to move or not move.
Move.
Amendment 20 has been moved. The question then is that Amendment 20 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division. This is a 32nd division. Please vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 20 is as follows. Yes, 28. No, 71. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I now call amendment 21 in the name of Alison Johnston, which has already been debated with amendment 15. And I ask Alison Johnston to move or not move.
Move.
The Amendment has been moved. The question, therefore, is that Amendment 21 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. There will now be a 30-second division. Please vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 21 is yes 28, no 71. There were no abstentions and the amendment is therefore not agreed. That then brings us to Group 4, Report to the Parliament on Operation of Part 2. And I call Amendment 4 in the name of the Minister, Paul Wheelhouse, in a group on its own, and I ask the Minister to move and speak to the amendment.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This amendment has been agreed following correspondence with the Parliament's Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee on points raised in their Stage 1 report on the bill. Specifically, the committee expressed concerns over the scrutiny of use of the environmental regulation powers in Part 2 of the bill. The committee has rightly identified this as an important part of the bill, and this amendment requires ministers to lay an annual report before the Scottish Parliament on the operation of Part 2 of the Regulatory Reform Scotland Act. Such reports will give the Parliament and the Government the opportunity to scrutinise the operation of this part of the Act, and in particular the operation of the environmental regulation powers, with a view to ensuring effective parliamentary scrutiny of the exercise of these powers. I move this amendment, which I believe to be a proportionate, targeted, consistent, transparent and accountable response to the committee's concerns.
And I call Nigel Dawn.
Very much, Presiding Officer, because I would like, as the convener of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, just to thank the Minister for his comments and for taking that amendment. And I think this reflects the good working between our committee and the Government, which I hope will continue.
Minister, do you wish to respond? Thank you. In which case, the question is that Amendment 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is agreed. That then brings us to Group 5, Applications to Review Marine Licensing Decisions, Permission to Proceed. And I call Amendment 5 in the name of the Minister, Fergus Ewing, grouped with Amendments 6, 7 and 8. And I ask the Minister to move Amendment 5 and speak to all amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move Amendment 5 and speak to the others. Amendments 5, 6 and 7 change the terminology in Section 63B to align with the intended terminology in the upcoming Courts Reform Bill by changing references to the word leave to that of the word permission. Amendment 8 removes what we consider on reflection is an ambiguous provision on the interaction between the application for a review of marine licensing decisions and the Court's decision on whether to grant permission for the application to proceed. Currently, Section 63B4 suggests that there may be a separate need for the applicant to apply for permission for the Section 63A application to proceed before the Court can make its decision. That is not the process envisaged. There is no need for a separate application for permission. The Court will have sufficient information to make its decision for permission on the basis of the Section 63 application. So Amendment 7 simply removes Section 63B4.
Many thanks, Minister. I have no request to speak. Do you wish to add anything else? In which case, the question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is agreed. I now call Amendments 6, 7 and 8, all in the name of the Minister and all previously debated. And I invite the Minister to move Amendments 6 to 8 en bloc, please.
Moved en bloc.
Many thanks. I ask whether any member objects to a single question being put on Amendments 6 to 8. Does any member object? Since no member objects, the question then is that Amendments 6 to 8 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is agreed. That then brings us to Group 6, Planning Authorities' Functions, Charges and Fees. And I call Amendment 10 in the name of Margaret McDougall, which is grouped with Amendments 11 to 14. And I ask Margaret McDougall to move Amendment 10 and to also speak to all amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. These amendments aim to deal with the issues raised in the evidence sessions over the idea to link planning fees to performance. The proposals on planning fees is one of the most frequently answered of all the consultation questions, and many concerns were raised at that stage. The amendments I have tabled are either to seek to remove the section entirely or add in certain safeguards to the process. Amendment 10 seeks to ensure that Scottish ministers must prepare and publish guidance setting out the principles to which they must have regard in determining whether the functions of a planning authority are not being or have not been performed satisfactorily, and outline this guidance before Parliament. Nowhere are the definitions of satisfactory and non-satisfactory performance set out, and this could be a very subjective concept. So, by adding this amendment, it makes sure the process is rigorous. While I welcome that the Minister, Derek Mackay, confirmed at stage 2 that the Scottish Government would provide assistance to improve the performance of a planning authority before resources are removed, I still feel that this should be a statutory requirement listed in the bill, and that all reasonable steps should be taken before the ministers are allowed to place sanctions on a planning authority. Therefore, my second amendment adds this to the bill. It seeks to ensure that the planning authority is not adversely affected by the provisions, either in the form of its performance or the range of services offered. If these provisions are genuinely here to improve and incentivise planning authorities, then it would make no sense to penalise them to such an extent that it further affects their performance, which could potentially result in them being penalised further through something that might be no fault of their own. And of course, it introduces unnecessary financial uncertainty around a local authority's funding. Amendment 12 is self-explanatory and states that the Government must ensure that the level and the period of that lower fees are put in place for would not adversely affect the performance of, or as the case may be, the range of services offered by the planning authority. Amendment 13 asks that before making any changes, the Scottish Government must lay before the Scottish Parliament a statement setting out percentage variation by which and the period for which they propose to vary the fee or charge. This would ensure that power cannot be misused and would offer safeguards which I feel are not currently explicitly stated within the bill itself. This would also allow for parliamentary scrutiny of the changes, again providing additional safeguards which I feel are not currently present within the legislation. The above 4 amendments would not drastically alter the function of Section 41, but rather strengthen the proposal by adding safeguards which are not currently present, ensuring planning authorities are not unfairly penalised and allowing Parliament scrutiny of the changes. They would also add more transparency and openness to the legislation, and I hope that this is something we can all support. Failing the section being amended, Amendment 14 seeks to remove Section 41 from the bill in its entirety. As COSLA has stated in a letter to the committee, the changes were fundamentally too much ministerial interference in the operations of specific council services. It is the job of the democratically elected councillors to scrutinise the process, not central government. The Scottish Government is demonstrating through this bill a worrying trend of centralisation. We should not be taking functions away from local councils but extending them through more devolution. These amendments are also supported by Scottish Environment Link, and I'm grateful to them for that support. If the rest of my amendments fall, then I feel removing Section 41 is the only sensible option, as it potentially gives Scottish ministers too much control over the planning process. No safeguards exist within the bill itself, and there is nothing to ensure that all reasonable steps will be taken to improve the performance of the planning authority. There is no function within the bill itself to provide proper parliamentary scrutiny to any proposed variations in fees, and COSLA have made it clear that they do not support this for the reasons I have already stated. I move amendments 10 to 14.
Thank you. I have 2 requests to speak. I would intend to take the members as long as they're brief. Murdo Fraser, to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I would commend Margaret McDougall for her dogged pursuit of these particular issues throughout Stage 1 and at Stage 2. This was an issue we debated fully at Stage 1 in committee when we took evidence and when we prepared our report. And we did hear from COSLA and other stakeholders concern about this right to reduce fees in the event of poor performance. Much like the first debate this afternoon, I do think ministers have overall struck the right balance on this one. I think adopting a carrot and stick approach is the right thing to do with higher planning fees, but the opportunity in the event of poor performance to reduce them. So for that reason, we would not be supporting Amendment 14, which takes out Section 41 in its entirety. In relation to the other amendments, I think Amendment 10, which is the requirement for consultation prior to guidance being issued, is a very reasonable one. And I noticed what Margaret McDougall said about the lack of definition of satisfactory performance. So we will be supporting Amendment 10. Amendment 11 seems to me to put too broad an obligation on Scottish ministers, and Amendments 12 and 13 seem to me to be too bureaucratic when it comes to their operation. So we will support Amendment 10, but unfortunately not the other amendments in this group.
Thank you very much. Before I call Malcolm Chisholm, can I say that as we are nearing the agreed time limit, I am prepared to exercise my power under Rule 9.8.4a to allow the debate on this group to continue beyond the limit in order to avoid the debate being unreasonably curtailed. But I do also add that we are still tight for time. Malcolm Chisholm.
I think we can all understand the theoretical reasons for Section 41, but we can also understand that they could potentially have one of two negative consequences. Firstly, if the authority is penalised, the service may well get worse, but equally worrying, the prospect of penalty may mean that an authority emphasises speed, and speed may be at the expense of the quality of the process of scrutinising the planning application. So I am worried about the negative consequences. I think Margaret McDougall's amendments do address some of the concerns. It is certainly surprising that we have a very unconstrained power in Section 41. There are no regulations attached to it, there are no criteria attached to it, and I think Margaret McDougall has very sensibly said we must have criteria, we must have assurance that the Scottish Government will take every action before imposing a penalty, and we mustn't have negative consequences as a result of the penalty. So I think it would be reasonable for everyone to support the first 4 amendments from Margaret McDougall, even if they don't support the final one.
Many thanks. I now call the Minister, who on this occasion is Derek Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The work by Government on Planning has been proportionate, positive and focused on encouragement, incentivisation, new investment, support and replicating best practice. However, the Scottish Government is convinced Section 41 is necessary to incentivise performance improvement. Corporate council attention is one of the things we need to improve in order to achieve a better planning service. Section 41 will improve behaviour and outcomes, and there should be no loss of income if planning authorities step up to the plate, as I believe they will. The high-level group on planning performance has already identified a set of 15 performance markers which reflect key areas of essential good performance and service quality across the planning service. These performance markers have been considered by COSLA and were welcomed by the Economy Committee as a qualitative and quantitative method of assessing performance of a planning authority. They are the aspects of good performance and service quality that we expect to see implemented consistently across Scotland. Far too often, performance has been far too variable. The detailed practical arrangements for the use of Section 41 provisions have been taken forward with our COSLA partners through the high-level group. Setting working arrangements and processes are explicit in the remit of that group, and I have committed to informing the Economy Committee of the outcome of these discussions. We consider that working in partnership with COSLA, Heads of Planning Scotland, Solus, Solar and the RTPI through the high-level group is to agree the detailed practical arrangements is the best way forward. In the meantime, the Scottish Government continues to work closely with planning authorities to help them improve. For example, we recently provided each authority with written feedback on their second planning performance framework reports, bringing a particularly sharp focus to the agreed performance markers. And through our planning reform, Next Steps programme and action plan, we're working with our local government partners to establish and roll out good practice in a range of aspects that will improve the quality of the planning service. In addition to that comprehensive action plan, to properly establish a link between performance and fees, moving towards full cost recovery, it is only right that we can guarantee improved performance. The old adage, you get what you pay for. Therefore, for this and a number of other reasons, the Scottish Government does not support these amendments.
Thank you. And I now call on Margaret McDougall to wind up and indicate, please, if you intend to press or withdraw.
Thank you. It's disappointing that the Government won't accept these amendments, and it seems to me that they had made their mind up at an early stage of the bill's passage. Because despite what COSLA and now Environmental Scotland Link have said, they will not listen to any arguments to remain. In fact, when the Minister stated just now that incentivising by removing funding through fees says more about this Government than it does about this bill. I continue and press my amendments.
Thank you. In that case, the question is that Amendment 10 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division. This will be a 1-minute division. Please press your voting buttons now. The result of the vote on amendment number 10 is as follows. Yes 39, no 60. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. I now call amendment 11 in the name of Margaret McDougall, which has already been debated with amendment 10. And I ask Margaret McDougall to move or not move.
Move.
The amendment has been moved. The question therefore is that amendment 11 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. There will be a 30-second division. Please vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 11 is yes 27, no 72. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. I now call amendment 12 in the name of Margaret McDougall, which has already been debated with amendment 10, and I ask Margaret McDougall to move or not to move.
Move.
The amendment has been moved. The question is then that amendment 12 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. This will be a 30-second division. Please vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 12 is yes 26, no 72. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. And I now call Amendment 13 in the name of Margaret McDougall, already debated with Amendment 10. And I ask Margaret McDougall to move or not move.
Move.
The amendment has been moved. The question then is that Amendment 13 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. There will be a 30-second division. Please vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 13 is yes 27, no 71. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Which brings us then to amendment 14, which I call in the name of Margaret McDougall, which has already been debated with amendment 10. And I ask Margaret McDougall to move or not move.
Move.
The amendment has been moved, and the question is that amendment 14 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. There will be a 30-second division. Please vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 14 is yes 27, no 71. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. I now call amendment 22 in the name of Alison Johnston, which has already been debated with amendment 15, and I ask Alison Johnston to move or not move.
Not moved.
The amendment is not moved. Therefore, that brings us to amendment 9, and I call amendment 9 in the name of the Minister, Fergus Ewing, which has already been debated with amendment 2, and I ask the Minister to move formally.
Formally moved.
Thank you. Question then is that amendment 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Sorry, I'm going to call that again. Can I have order, please? Question is that amendment 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is agreed. That ends consideration of amendments and brings us to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 8745 in the name of Fergus Ewing on the Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill. Could members leaving the chamber please do so quietly? And I invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, please. Before I invite the Minister to open the debate, I call on the Cabinet Secretary to signify Crown consent to the bill. Please, John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, for the purposes of Rule 9(11) of the Standing Orders, I wish to advise Parliament that Her Majesty, having been informed of the purport of the Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill, has consented to place her prerogative and interest, so far as they are affected by the bill, at the disposal of Parliament for the purposes of the bill.
Many thanks, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Paul Wheelhouse to speak to and move the motion in the name of Fergus Ewing. Minister, technically you have 10 minutes, but we're incredibly tight for time, so less would be better. Thank you.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would like to begin the formal Stage 3 debate by thanking the members and clerks of the committees involved for their careful consideration of the Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill. I would also like to thank the external stakeholders who have taken the time to engage in the bill process and share their knowledge and views during the scrutiny process. As members, I'm sure, will highlight, regulation is essential to protect our people and environment and helping businesses to flourish and create jobs. The critical issue is how best we deliver these necessary outcomes. Regulatory reform is a cross-government agenda that makes a key contribution to the Scottish Government's purpose of increasing sustainable economic growth as expressed in the Government Economic Strategy. I am pleased to be at a point today where I believe we have a bill that will truly make a difference to Scotland and bring benefits to our environment, businesses and communities. Presiding Officer, in contrast to the approach in other jurisdictions where deregulation may be an objective, the purpose of this bill is to streamline and make regulation more effective. The bill deals with 4 distinct but connected themes: Part 1 of the bill will help reduce unnecessary burdens on business, and business has provided examples of growth being constrained by inconsistent application of regulation across Scotland, different forms, different fees, and in some cases different timescales. This bill includes provisions to define and implement national standards and systems and introduces a duty for regulators to contribute to achieving sustainable economic growth through their mainstream regulatory activity. Regulators will be required to take account of sustainable economic growth where appropriate and be more accountable for decisions. I would like at this point to quote section 4.1, which states, "In exercising its regulatory functions, each regulator must contribute to achieving sustainable economic growth, except to the extent that it would be inconsistent with the exercise of those functions to do so." I make this point because regulators will be supported in this by a new statutory code of practice, which will be consulted on shortly. It is right to place this duty on regulators to contribute to sustainable economic growth alongside existing or balancing duties. As section 4.1 and in respect of SEPA specifically, section 38 make clear, the bill does not prioritise sustainable economic growth over other regulatory objectives. There is no conflict here, but potential opportunities. It will ensure greater transparency and provide line of sight to the Scottish Government's purpose, which is essential if we are to have a consistency of delivery across all regulators. The Scottish Government's economic strategy includes a commitment to better regulation. This recognises the fact that whilst regulatory outcomes in themselves contribute to sustainable economic growth, the way that regulators carry out their work in practice and interact with those they regulate and vice versa can also make a contribution, a significant contribution, to supporting business and hence contributing further to sustainable economic growth. Good regulators seek to understand those they regulate, including taking economic and business factors appropriately into account in carrying out their regulatory activities. And Part 2 of the bill will support SEPA's transformation programme and improve the way environmental regulations are applied in practice across Scotland. The bill will introduce the first statutory purpose for SEPA, focused not just on the environment but also on health and well-being and sustainable economic growth in support of the Government's purpose. A simplified and integrated framework for environmental regulation to help unwind complexity, and new enforcement tools with real teeth for SEPA and the criminal courts. This will allow SEPA to target its activity where the risk and potential benefits are greatest. The way that SEPA works with business and other stakeholders can make a direct contribution to having a favourable business environment in Scotland. There has been much debate about this point, I recognise that, but let me stress, having a good environment is integral to having a good economy. As the First Minister said at the World Forum on Natural Capital in November, natural capital is one of the ways in which we can tell whether our economic growth is truly sustainable. You can't do that if you're only thinking about taxation, spending and GDP on a year-to-year basis without considering the resources and assets which underpin our prosperity and promote our well-being. Indeed, we've had a very constructive discussion at the Scottish Biodiversity Committee only this week around the Natural Capital Asset Index. And of course, this is a valuable addition to our efforts to enable going beyond GDP as a measure of success and to augment the National Performance Framework. Equally, the health of Scotland's communities and environment contribute to or are interlinked with and dependent upon the achievement of sustainable economic growth. Economic growth that exceeds the limits of our environment or damages social and community cohesion is ultimately unsustainable. And there are initiatives that can deliver growth while reducing our resource take, for example, developing a circular economy. Part 3 of the bill further demonstrates the value in achieving this balance. It will help improve the performance of planning authorities by establishing a legislative link between planning fees and performance. On the one hand, we want to be sure that increased funding leads to improved planning performance by authorities. On the other, we recognise the contribution planning makes to protect and enhance Scotland's natural and built environment so that Scotland's people can enjoy a better quality of life. By speeding up the process of resolving legal challenges, this part of the bill will also potentially reduce delays to offshore marine energy projects. This will help Scotland to achieve its 2020 renewables targets and help promote growth in this vital industry. And the Scottish Government is committed not only to maintaining a business environment that supports sustainable economic growth, but also to enhancing Scotland's natural and built environment as an asset for both. During parliamentary scrutiny of the bill, we have also faced some questions about transparency and accountability. Following amendments at stage 2 and 3, all directions, guidance and codes will be published, and the Parliament will also have the opportunity to consider an annual report on the operation of Part 2 of the bill, thanks to the amendment that we just passed. And this welcome parliamentary input adds value to the Scottish Government's better regulation programmes and will help ensure that future regulation can also be proportionate, consistent, transparent, accountable and targeted. As well as working closely in partnership with our stakeholders on the delivery of better regulation in Scotland, we are also sharing knowledge and experience across the UK and devolved administrations. And through this partnership approach, we can drive best practice here in Scotland, where our views and experiences can inform others and help shape future agendas, for example in Brussels, where so many regulations are of course set. Presiding Officer, hopefully this will help with the timing of the debate. I can bring my conclusions to a close. This Government is fully committed to developing better regulation to both support sustainable economic growth and to improving the protection of our precious environment. This bill will make a vital contribution, and its success will depend on ongoing partnership working and stakeholder engagement. Presiding Officer, I move that the Parliament agrees that the Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill be passed.
Thank you, Minister. That is helpful, but we are still incredibly tight for time across the whole of the afternoon. I now call on Jenny Marra, maximum 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It was with a sceptical eye that Labour viewed this legislation at stage 1, and to my mind with good reason. We must always resist the slow creep of centralisation, particularly through framework legislation such as this bill, unless we are absolutely certain that centralisation is the best option. And so, when examining the central component of this bill, namely the new powers for Scottish ministers over regulations and the bodies that fulfil regulatory functions, we made it clear at stage 1 that we could not vote in favour of this bill unless we were satisfied, firstly, that there was proper scrutiny to complement the Scottish Government's new functions, secondly, that these new functions did not adversely impact on the ability of local authorities to adapt and adjust to local circumstances. And thirdly, that the duty called sustainable economic growth would not have unintended consequences on regulators to prioritise one consideration over all other essential functions. Now, I want to turn to our third concern in the first instance, if I may. Today, the Labour Party voted again with Alison Johnson's amendments, seeking to either remove any reference to the Sustainable Economic Growth Clause from the bill or change that duty to sustainable development. Now, we did so, as I put in the arguments at stage 1 and at stage 2, we did so because of the wealth of evidence given to the committee during its sessions that pointed towards the legal difficulties with the government's proposed duty. Particularly, and it bears repeating, the evidence given by Professor Andrea Ross of the University of Dundee, who said, regardless of how this government interprets sustainable economic growth, there is no guarantee that a future government or the courts will not interpret it to mean a stable economy with no mention of its impact on ecological and social sustainability. Now, the clause for sustainable economic growth remains at best a legal grey area. However, the Government has sought to reassure us on 3 separate occasions now that there are adequate provisions within the bill to safeguard in respect of their other functions. For example, the hard-fought health and safety laws that this party has campaigned for over the years. Now, we are debating these hypotheticals and discussing future scenarios which we hope do not arise. And in debating this for about the 3rd time, as the Minister said, I can see that the Minister is not going to budge. So I can only say to the Government that I hope their assurances throughout this debate that the pursuit of that clause for regulators will not come at the sacrifice of the other functions and are followed up by close scrutiny of the bill as it passes today. I'm sorry, Minister, I won't on this occasion because I know we're tight for time. Turning to our first and second concerns that I outlined at the beginning, around the need for transparency and accountability, and the need to protect local authority discretion, I am pleased to see that the Minister has listened and has sought to improve the bill on both counts. I was grateful after stage 2 to receive a letter from Fergus Ewing reiterating his commitment to utter transparency when the Government are exercising their new functions resulting from this bill. And I was pleased again when the Government brought forward amendments at stage 2 that would see any direction for variation in regulation to be published, the guidance on the Sustainable Economic Growth Clause and the Code of Practice, as Paul Wheelhouse just mentioned, to be published too. Today's amendment from Paul Wheelhouse, which will see the Government report to Parliament on its environmental regulation. Now, these are all welcome developments and will aid our future assessment of the effectiveness of this law. Similarly, the amendments put forward at stage 2 by Fergus Ewing that exempt local authorities from the Sustainable Economic Growth Duty are also to be welcomed. We believe that not having this duty apply to them on the face of the bill will significantly allow them to prioritise their regular functions according to the varying and changing circumstances that they find themselves in locally. This again is to be welcomed. However, I am disappointed, as my colleague Margaret McDougall said, that the Government did not accept her amendments, which I think had sympathy across the Chamber and which I believe would have increased that flexibility further in the planning process. In summary, Presiding Officer, Labour will be voting for this bill today, despite having enduring concerns around the future operation of the Sustainable Economic Growth Clause. I would urge the Minister in closing to monitor and reflect with some regularity on the impact the duty is having on Scotland's regulatory system, and not to let it erode some of the other very important functions of our regulators. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Murdo Fraser. Maximum 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. A lack of consistency clearly is in the air this afternoon. As for the Scottish Conservatives, we are consistent in our view. We welcome this bill and we will be voting for it at decision time today again. We do have one concern, which I highlighted briefly earlier and I will return to later. But overall, I think this is a good piece of legislation which will make it easier for businesses in Scotland to operate and will enhance the performance of SEPA in particular. As convener of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee, I'd like to reiterate my thanks I expressed at stage 1 to my fellow committee members for their assistance in dealing with this legislation and to our ever-efficient and supportive team of clerks. We considered a number of substantive issues at stage 2 and again this afternoon, and I think we had a good debate where that was required. The genesis of this bill was the Scottish Government's regulatory review group. Too often these government-appointed committees are no more than talking shops, so it's good to see some positive changes emerging from the work that has been done. At the core of this bill is the introduction of an economic duty on public bodies. This is an ambition the Scottish Conservatives have had for many years. It was in our manifestos in 2007, 2010 and 2011, and I'm delighted, therefore, to see it now become law. As my good friend, the late David McCletchie, once commented in this chamber, the next best thing to a Conservative government is an SNP government delivering Conservative policies. And I look forward to many more aspects of our manifestos becoming the law in due course. Now, we heard throughout the passage of this bill concerns from some that a duty on regulators to contribute to achieving sustainable economic growth was inappropriate. The only real concern I had myself was with the question of definition, but I think that has now been resolved following an undertaking from the Scottish Government that the definition will be explicitly stated in guidance. Now, I appreciate there will be those in the chamber, not least from the Green Party, who take a different view to my own party on this, and I respect their stance. But I happen to believe that promoting sustainable economic growth is in everyone's interest. I'm not surprised to hear the Green Party take a different view. I'm slightly more surprised at the attitude of the Labour Party this afternoon. We know, of course, that actions of successive Labour governments have had the effect of destroying economic growth in our country, not least the ruination by Gordon Brown of the public finances. I'm just a little bit surprised to hear Labour being so open in admitting their opposition to economic growth. The one concern I had with this bill was the introduction, at a fairly late stage in the process, of measures which would allow the implementation of the plastic bag tax. Now, as I said earlier, and I won't rehearse all the arguments, I'm not convinced that this is appropriate or will have the consequences its promoters intend. I think perhaps more important than the substance of the issue is the way in which this change was introduced, because there was no opportunity at stage 1 for committees of this Parliament to scrutinise the proposals, to take evidence, to quiz ministers and hold the proposal up to the light, because it was only at the very last moment, just before the stage 1 debate, that the intention to bring this measure in was signalled. There was a very short debate at stage 2 and an equally short consideration this afternoon. And I don't believe, Deputy Presiding Officer, this is the way that legislation of this nature should be dealt with. There are concerns from industry about the impact of this tax. It is a matter which should have been given proper parliamentary scrutiny, and it's regrettable this was not allowed. Yes, of course.
Minister.
A very great brief. Just to reassure Murdo Fraser, we obviously we have debated before the reasons for bringing this forward at this stage, but I would just want to reassure members that we are learning a lot from what's happened in Wales, and there are similar procedures in place, and indeed fixed penalty notices in Wales. And this is something that we have studied, so that we have reasonable confidence that it does work in practice and that the number of businesses being charged penalties is fairly low.
Murdo Fraser, you're going into your last minute.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm interested to hear that from the Minister. I think, frankly, it would have been better if that evidence had been brought to Parliament and we could all have debated that in committee and in Parliament, and I'm sorry that opportunity was lost. But that concern I've raised will not prevent me and my colleagues from voting for the bill today, because we feel overall it is beneficial. Over the years, I've heard a great many concerns from businesses about the way regulation impacts on them. And often it's not the regulations themselves, but the way they are interpreted on the ground. This can be a particular problem when we have 32 local authorities in Scotland, many of them interpreting the same regulation in different ways. And this can have a particular challenge, for example, as we heard in stage 1, for mobile food retailers who are selling their products in different local authority areas. And we also hear regularly from businesses concerns about the planning system, which I think this bill will go some way to try and redress. And I hope that the threat of reduced planning fees will be enough to ensure excellent performance. And I genuinely welcome the constructive language that has been used by ministers in this area in terms of how they will engage with local authorities and planning departments. So we're going to get a better system of regulation, a faster and more responsive planning system, and a requirement for public bodies to promote sustainable economic growth. That's what this bill delivers. That's what the Scottish Conservatives wish to see from our public agencies, and that's why we'll be pleased to support this bill at stage 3 this afternoon.
Thank you very much. We're incredibly tight for time. If members take their full 4 minutes, then I won't be able to call everyone who wishes to speak in the debate. Mike Mackenzie, to be followed by Margaret McDougall.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's difficult to imagine who would be against regulations that aim to be transparent, proportionate, consistent and accountable. Who would be against regulation that's appropriately targeted when and where it's required? And that's what this bill aims to do. And to my mind, it's a useful step forward in achieving that purpose. And in passing, I very much welcome the Tory support articulated by Murdo Fraser this afternoon. Perhaps they're not better together with Labour after all. I believe too that a more consistent, efficient and effective approach to regulation can enhance economic growth. And I was pleased to hear in committee that Professor Russell Griggs, who chairs the Regulatory Review Group, he indicated that this bill would, in his opinion, enhance sustainable economic growth. And I assume that all members are in favour of sustainable economic growth, not least because this enhancing the economy is one of the main tools for tackling poverty. And I simply don't accept that the twin aims of improving sustainable growth and improving the environment are mutually incompatible. The debate over the semantics of economic growth as against economic development has been, to my mind, a false one. And despite my repeated requests, no one giving evidence to the committee was able to demonstrate what they meant by reference to a real-life example. The Federation of Small Businesses gave ample evidence of the increasing burden of compliance and the confusion and difficulty and cost that arises when different approaches are taken to regulation in different areas, sometimes even within the same area, and often for no apparent good reason. It's important to heed this complaint. Not only are small businesses important in terms of the amount of employment they create in aggregate, but some of the small businesses of today will become the big businesses and the big employers of tomorrow. And one of the problems in our economy is that this progression of small businesses growing into big businesses happens all too rarely. The economists call it lack of churn. Today's fat cats need to be constantly challenged by tomorrow's lean and hungry cats. That's how we drive innovation and improve productivity. That's how we remain competitive. If we want to improve higher quality employment or provide higher quality employment, if we want to tackle unemployment, if we want to improve the fortunes of the working poor, we need to listen carefully to and support small businesses. A further misconception, which is featured in our discussions, is the apparent belief that most businesses willfully break regulations and wish to damage the environment. I believe the opposite is true. And one of the improvements that this bill offers is a greater ability on the part of SEPA to properly tackle real environmental crimes and problems. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I believe this bill is a step in the right direction, and I look forward to having full powers over regulation when we'll be able to do so much more.
Thank you very much. I call Margaret McDougall to be followed by Chick Roddy.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As Murdo Fraser said, I have been dogged in the varying of planning authority fees, having pushed my amendments both in stage 2 and 3 of the Regulatory Reform Bill. And I'm disappointed that the Government is still not persuaded to support them, as I believe that they were sensible and responsible amendments, that they either added safeguards where none currently exist or seek to remove Section 41 if additional safeguards were not introduced. If I have time.
Minister.
Can I thank the member for taking the intervention? I think it's fair to say that some of the points you are making were fair and reasonable, that which the government was going to do anyway, but you missed the point, or the member misses the point in some of the amendments. This is not a centralising government, because the government already has the power to set planning fees as subject to parliamentary scrutiny,
Briefly,
and that
Minister.
has not changed in any way.
Margaret McDougall.
But it's around the varying of fees and using that as a sanction against planning authorities. Democratically elected councillors already sit on planning authorities, as I said earlier, and I'm confident that they understand their responsibilities. And Audit Scotland already monitors planning authorities' performance and makes recommendations to address any concerns they have. So why is this government so intent on penalising planning authorities? In an earlier response to my amendments, the Minister, Derek Mackay, stated that Section 41 would improve the behaviour and outcomes, and there will be no loss of income because planning authorities will step up to the plate. I think this is a glib remark, implying planning authorities will do better if they are threatened with sanctions. As a former council leader himself, the Minister knows that delays can occur for all sorts of reasons. As Unison Scotland indicated, that delays are due to underfunding and heavy workloads, and that there is a range of community planning partners involved in the process, like Scottish Water and SEPA, yet there are no proposals to introduce carrots or sticks to these organisations. So this is a clear attack on planning authorities if no other organisation is being taken to task. This is why I believed it made sense that the Government would be required to lay a statement before Parliament before any action was taken, so this issue can be scrutinised. Yet, the Scottish Government does not support this move. Surely more transparency and scrutiny of Government decisions should be welcomed. So are we to assume that quantity rather than quality is the priority of this Government? And what happens to local accountability if this Government is going to step in when it decides a planning authority is underperforming? Despite all the Minister has said about the high-level group working with COSLA, when I spoke with COSLA yesterday, they were still of the view that there is fundamentally too much ministerial interference in the operations of a specific council service, and that it would be counterproductive to reduce fees. And it believes that before the clause is to be enacted, there needs to be agreement between COSLA and this Government on what counts as good performance. So I will reiterate calls that this needs to be made clear, so planning authorities know exactly what is considered to be satisfactory and non-satisfactory performance. This should not be left up to one person's objective view. I am disheartened that the Scottish Government has decided not to support my amendments today, because even if Clause 41 remained, the other amendments would have introduced more transparency in the process, allowed for greater scrutiny and oversight of decisions, and made clear to local authorities exactly what was expected of them. I would be grateful if the Minister, in his summing up, could address some of these concerns and offer reassurances that the Scottish Government will work closely to get an agreement with COSLA and other stakeholders regarding the issues that are still outstanding within Section 41.
Many thanks. The call check Brodie to be followed by Hansala Malik.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a member of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee, I am very happy to support this bill. Presiding Officer, change is a constant. No doubt concerns from those directly impacted and close to this issue feel that change is not necessary. They may argue that there is no need for change. There is. They may assert that our existing processes on protecting our people, our businesses, and above all our environment are already secured. They are wrong.
Mr Brodie, is your microphone?
Beg your pardon?
Thank you.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. They may aver that our current regulatory system is consistent, appropriate and accountable. It is not. That, Presiding Officer, is why I believe, and I say this with not a little compliance and commercial background, is that our regulatory framework, particularly in planning matters, has, and frankly in some cases, antediluvian and inconsistent. if we are to address the malaise and the problems that Mike Mackenzie referred to in terms of economic distribution, I believe this bill is very important in that it places a stake in the ground. That does not mean that it has to be a strangulation of environmental protection. Far from it. Sustainable economic growth and sustainable environmental development, I believe, Presiding Officer, if handled carefully and consistently, are twins that can be joined at the hip. And the bill and the code of practice contained therein strengthens that. But across our nation, that means consistent and better regulation, and that means overcoming the hurdles or the unnecessary hurdles that could get in the way of desired and essential economic success. Nor will it, I believe, Presiding Officer, lend substance to the claim that it will necessarily confuse existing and specified regulators. If we are to grow economically and successfully for the reasons specified, we have to rid ourselves of the obstacles that stand in the way of efficiency, effectiveness and that secure environmental protection. We have to be, our local authorities have to be, our planners have to be more embracive of these 3 E's. And I propose that, in the hope that there is no naivety in this statement, that given the Government's commitment to ensure that communities and consumers will be involved in the deliberations of the future application of the bill via the Code of Practice, that it will be seen in that light and not as an amber light for those who would traduce the principles of the bill as they skip along to the nearest tribunal or court. Presiding Officer, the 3-legged stool of this bill that firstly encourages consistency of application while contributing to sustainable economic growth, which secondly develops and enhances environmental regulatory powers, and thirdly, which, and long overdue, allows regulations to be developed where planning fees can be and are related to performance, is solid. We all, consumers, planners, environmentalists, business and government, today take a major step forward for Scotland's growth and its environment, as they are enshrined in this bill. I support it.
Many thanks. Colin Malik to be followed by Christian Allard.
Thank you very much and good afternoon, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak on the Regulatory Reform Bill today. My 17 years' experience as a local councillor and chair of Development Regeneration Services meant that I have seen the planning process up close and appreciate that reform was needed. I agree with the intention of the bill to secure more favourable business conditions in Scotland and development benefits for the environment. As always, there will be disagreements as how to achieve this. At stage 1, serious reservations were raised regarding the proposed duty of regulators of sustainable economic growth. The provision hands regulators conflicting remits, which at best is unhelpful. Since then, the Scottish Government has given reassurances that the duty would not prioritise sustainable economic growth over other regulatory objections such as health and safety, an important element. A lot of my concerns stemmed from the lack of clarity in relation to the meaning of sustainable economic growth. Therefore, I welcome the Scottish Government's intention to provide definitions of sustainable economic growth and sustainable development in its guidance. Whilst I supported Alison Johnston's Stage 3 amendments addressing this issue, there have been sufficient reassurance and concessions by the Scottish Government that I feel reasonably confident in supporting the bill as a whole today. As for penalising poorly performing local authorities, Derek Mackay confirmed to the Economic, Energy and Tourism Committee that the Scottish Government would provide assistance to the performance of the planning authorities before resources are withdrawn or removed. Unfortunately, my colleague Margaret McDougall's amendments to make this undertaking part of the bill were not fruitful, but I will be interested to see how this is implemented, as an already cash-stricken councils are struggling to make ends meet today. Yes, sir.
I think that's a very helpful point, and I thank the member for taking the intervention. And it's to make the point that last year, or this current financial year, saw the largest increase in planning fees since this Parliament was created, of some 20%. But if we want to continue investing in the planning service, to continue raising planning fees, I have to have a guarantee that we get improved performance. So the two go together, improved performance and increased fees, to do the resource job that Mr Malik has requested.
Thank you very much. Hamzala Malik, last 45 seconds, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. No, I don't disagree with the Minister in terms of improved performances. What I have reservations about is the cost of that. I think that's very important for local authorities. And may I also take this opportunity to thank Murdo Fraser for his captainship of the committee. He's done a marvellous job during this bill. I've been on the committee for a very short period of time, but his chairmanship has been very helpful. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Christian Allard, after which we move to closing speeches. Up to 4 minutes, less would be more, please.
Presiding Officer, I welcome this stage-free debate today on the Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill. I read with interest the Stage 1 report on the bill published by the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee on October the 8th last year. Unfortunately for me, today I joined the committee a month later in November. The purpose of the bill was clear from the outset: to improve the way regulation is developed and applied across Scotland, to protect the people and their environment, to help businesses to flourish and create jobs. There has been much work done at committee level, both in our committee and in the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. I read from the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee report that the Scottish Government adopted the 5 key principles for regulation functions proposed by the Regulatory Review Group. Regulation should be exercised in a way that is transparent, accountable, proportionate, consistent and targeted only at cases in which action is needed. Again, the intention is clear. This government has a distinct better regulation agenda, one to create a more successful country through increasing economic growth. Not only will this bill improve the efficiency and affordability of the public sector, it will also provide a more supportive business environment. Presiding Officer, let me give you 3 examples of how the bill will achieve this. The first example is the way the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, SEPA, will be given a new statutory function, a broader role to reflect the sort of environmental regulator Scotland needs in the future. The way SEPA works with businesses and other stakeholders has already changed beyond recognition. However, this bill will provide a simpler legislative framework for SEPA, reducing the administrative burden on businesses and making it easier for them to understand SEPA's role in protecting them and communities from environmental harm. The second example is in the way this bill will bring transparency to policy development and decision-making in offshore energy development. The seas around us have the potential to bring sustainable and renewable energy to a level that many countries would love to reach. With 25% of Europe's tidal power and 10% of its wave power, and with the potential that we have in offshore wind, Scotland needs better and quicker mechanisms in place to deal with both the concerns of the people affected by such a decision and the concern around lengthy delays for the people behind such vital projects for our country. The third and last example is in page 3 of the bill, to bring consistency and transparency in the regulation for mobile food businesses and to reduce the cost, when possible, for those businesses to operate. Presiding Officer, I worked all my life in the food industry before becoming to Parliament, and I will celebrate any good news to help food businesses to better cope with regulation. I can't wait for the new food body to be established in Scotland to make sure Scottish food is safe to eat and to improve the diet and nutrition of people like me who overindulge. But more importantly, an agency that will be an effective and proportionate regulator, supporting the Scottish food and drink industry in growing its strong international reputation for safe, quality food. I know that ministers are preparing a bill to create the new food body earlier this year. Presiding Officer, as I said, I can't wait to see it launched. I will support it as I support this bill to protect people and to help businesses to flourish.
Many thanks. And we now move to closing speeches. And I call on Gavin Brown. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It is a common complaint from businesses of all sizes that there is too much regulation and that the burden of red tape is too high. With the passing of this bill, it will remain, I'm sure, a common complaint that there is too much regulation and that the cost of regulation is too high. But I hope, and I think most of us in this chamber must hope, that that complaint will become just that little bit less common. Red tape, of course, comes from various sources. Some of it, of course, much of it, of course, comes from Brussels. Some of it comes from Westminster. Some of it comes from here. Some of it comes from councils. But we have to focus on what we can do, and I think this bill quite rightly does that, focusing on the legislation that will flow from this place and focusing on the regulators, of course, that were set up in broad terms by this place. It's not just the regulations that pass that cause angst to businesses, but it is often the way in which they are enforced and the inconsistency with which they are enforced across different parts of the country. So we welcome this bill. We welcome, as my colleague Murdo Fraser said earlier, the better regulation agenda as a whole, and indeed all of the work carried out by the Regulatory Review Group since it was set up. The policy memorandum for the bill states that they intend to improve the way regulation is developed and applied, creating more favourable business conditions in Scotland and delivering benefits for the environment. Those are suggestions and ideas that we can sign up to. So this bill deals with the flow of regulation passing through this place. I think the issue that has attracted the most attention, not just today, but I think in the Stage 1 debate and indeed in the work carried out by the committee, was the duty of regulators in respect of sustainable economic growth. As I said in the debate earlier, I think the government have called this right. I think there is a fine balance. I think there are good points put forward, actually, even from those against the provision. But I think, actually, the way in which it has been framed is the right way to do it. And it does, in my view, make it clear that it doesn't sacrifice the other and core functions of those regulators. It is additional to and as well as those core functions. I know some have worries about that becoming the overall priority against what the regulators were set up to do. I don't share those fears. I haven't done since Stage 1. I do think the way in which the original clause was written, making it clear that they had to contribute to achieving sustainable economic growth, was correct, along with the caveat that except to the extent that it would be inconsistent with the exercise of those functions to do so. That was set up, I think, right from the very start of the bill. I think the additional security given by the government, secured through the committee, about the way in which the code and the guidance will be set up strengthens that, and I think reduces the risks that I think were quite rightly pointed out, but in my view I think they have been dealt with fairly well. The Federation of Small Businesses pointed out in their written submission right at the start how the code is monitored and reported on will determine how effective it will be in changing practice. To produce legislation is one thing, but actually in many ways the hard work is now to begin for the government and the Parliament. Setting out a framework is one thing, but actually what will matter most is now what goes into the guidance and what goes into the code of practice. And I think that's harder to define and to put together even in the stage with the primary legislation. So the work is far from complete. It's really just beginning. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us, the Economy Committee in particular, the government obviously in particular, but parliamentarians across the board, to ensure that we get the code and the guidance right so that actually the legislation does in practice what it was set up to do. That's why we'll be supporting it come decision time at 5 o'clock. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now call on Jenny Mara. Up to 6 minutes, please. Less would be more.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to begin by dealing with the amendments that Murdo Fraser put forward earlier this afternoon, seeking to repeal the Scottish Government's Stage 2 amendment that inserted enforcement provisions for the carrier bag charge that they're in the process of introducing. During Stage 2 and again today, Mr Fraser argued against the Government's amendment on 2 counts, I think. one on the substance of the policy and the other on the process of how the Government have sought to introduce it at this late stage. Now, I agree with Mr Fraser that it was a bit of a surprise when the Government amendment came out of the blue at stage 2, and I would share his concern about the lack of consultation on the amendment, as it was not discussed at all during stage 1, and it is a shame that we were not able to take evidence and give it more consideration at that point. Recapping on some of the points raised in today's debate, I would like to put on record again our continued unease, our support of Alison Johnson's amendments regarding the use of the clause called sustainable economic growth as a duty on the face of the bill. But I do accept the Government's assurances that it will do its utmost to ensure that regulators are not forced to compromise on their other equally important duties. And again, I welcome the Minister's drive towards greater transparency in the bill with the amendments he tabled at stage 2. And yet I remain disappointed that he did not see the value, as COSLA and others did, of accepting my colleague Margaret McDougall's amendments, which would have, in our opinion, bolstered the planning process in Scotland. Now, exempting local authorities from the need to pursue sustainable economic growth on the face of the bill is a welcome step, as I argued earlier, and I think people know why. I think COSLA and Unison gave evidence to the committee that made the case for maintaining the status quo in that regard. And we need to ensure that our local authorities are empowered to adapt to local situations, which can vary widely throughout Scotland. And if COSLA and others are telling us this is happening now, then we should listen, and I'm glad the Minister chose to do so at stage 2. I also want to touch upon the powers the bill gives to SEPA, something I think that has been a little lost in the debate due to the first part of the bill. Steps to ensure better safety measures for SEPA officers are, of course, very welcome. This bill extends the remit of SEPA quite extensively, and I am confident that the organisation will take on its new responsibilities with vigour. I have had the pleasure of meeting Professor David Sigsworth on a number of occasions, and have seen first-hand the benefit of his experience and expertise. In summary, Presiding Officer, we believe that this bill gives the Government the opportunity to bring about better regulation for Scotland. Yet in the new powers that Ministers are giving to themselves, they must also realise their great responsibility to keep those powers under review and ensure that the concerns shown from around the Chamber today and throughout the process, throughout the stage 1, 2 and 3 passage of this bill, are taken into proper and serious account. Thank you.
Many thanks for being so brief. I now call on Fergus Ewing. Up to 8 minutes to wind up, Minister. Please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to begin by thanking all of the members for their participation in this debate. To thank Murdo Fraser, now I don't know whether it's a promotion or not, but Captain Fraser, as he's taking that office this afternoon. But more seriously, to thank the convener of the ET Committee and the members for the work that they've done. And I think that has helped us to improve this bill throughout its passage. So we are grateful to the members and, of course, the clerks of that committee. I'd also like, I suppose, to slightly break with precedent, to just say that there are a number of very hard-working officials, and I'd just like to say who they are, because I think the amount of work that they've done on this bill has been considerable, because it's been a comprehensive bill covering a very wide range of areas which poses particular challenges. So to Joe Brown of the Better Regulation Industry Engagement, of Ian Black of Planning Modernisation, Stuart Fubister of Marine Licensing SGLD, Bridget Marshall and Richard MacLeod of Better Environmental Regulation, and Neil Watt, the Bill Manager, my most sincere thanks. And also Sandra Reid, who serves with the Regulatory Reform Group, has done a power of work on this bill, and that has made our tasks as ministers somewhat easier. And in addition, you have this afternoon, Presiding Officer, an unusual occurrence, a trio of ministers. This, I suspect, will be our one and only public performance. Let me turn to the debate, and perhaps in the brief, we will not, like Frank Sinatra, make a comeback, I can assure you, Presiding Officer. Let me turn to the debate and just touch on a couple of points. I think Gavin Brown made really a very good point, actually, a very kind of solid point there, that the hard work is really not yet begun, because the work that I will do, that Derek Mackay and Paul Wheelhouse will do with the respective portfolio responsibilities that we have, will be very substantial. It will be demanding. There will be parts of it which will not be easy. The duties to come forward with guidance and codes of practice, duties to engage with stakeholders, the duties to proceed in the onus on us as a Scottish Government to proceed in a transparent, open and fair way are ones that we take extremely seriously. These underpin the approach that we have taken in this bill, and they will also underpin the approach that we will take in implementing this bill and making it work. So I think Mr Brown made that point very well, and it's apt to repeat it. I think it is important to say that it's not correct, as I think Jenny Marrett may have said in her opening comments, that local authorities are exempt from this bill. I think if we look at section 1, it's clear that the planning functions of local authorities are exempt from this bill, but local authorities themselves are of course included in Schedule 1 in the list of bodies which are covered by the generality of this bill, and that relates both to section 1 and section 4, the duties in respect of consistency of application of regulations, and also the duty to have regard to sustainable economic growth. And I think that we've had useful debates, and Alison Johnson, I think, to be fair to her, has led these debates. I haven't agreed with her, but she's made them, I think, in a reasonable fashion throughout, so I would thank her for that. I understand her perspective. I think we don't share it, but we can, I hope, proceed and implement the bill in a way which perhaps will obtain her agreement in most cases. And in respect of the plastic bag tax, where the remarks of trenchant remarks of Murdo Fraser were listened to extremely carefully, we will let Parliament know through a letter from Cabinet Secretary Richard Lochhead at the end of the Stage 1 process, as soon as we are aware regarding the points that he raised. I wanted to respond to that. I'm advised by Mr Mackay that the point that...
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. Can you just repeat what he said? That didn't make sense to me at all. He said that he would write to me at the end of the Stage 1 process. Perhaps he could just reflect on what he said and correct that.
Well, I think the point that I'm being asked to make is that I'm advised that we did let Parliament know through a letter from Richard Lochhead at the end of the Stage 1 process of this bill that this was something that we were intending to do. So I'm just making the point that I think Mr Fraser, to be fair, made the point that Parliament should be properly consulted in the process of any legislation, and that's a point that I made a great deal, especially, I may say, Presiding Officer, when I was in opposition. So it's right that one puts into practice what one preaches, even in a past life long, long ago. Presiding Officer, I think what this bill will do will be enhanced by the cooperation we've had from COSLA, especially Stephen Hagan and his officials. I've been hugely heartened by the positive, constructive approach that we have taken together. Mike McKenzie mentioned the Federation of Small Business. They, I think, have been at the lead with other business organisations such as the Scottish Chambers of Commerce in driving this forward, and indeed the reference of mobile food vans, and I think Mr Fraser mentioned that. The first time when I became aware of this particular difficulty was actually at a meeting that I attended, hosted by the CBI, where one of their members encountered this problem. And the reason I mention that is that I think that today we are now doing something to put right an inconsistency which seemed to me at the time to involve an element of manifest unfairness. And I became aware of it because I attended a meeting of the CBI. So that engagement with the business organisations, all of them, the IOD as well, the SCDI, as well as the ones I've mentioned, and trade associations, helps us find out what is happening on the ground, Presiding Officer, out there in the world outside, the business world. And it shows that we can respond to what business wants when they raise it through their business organisations. I think that's a point that's well worth making. More recently, the Scottish Food Enforcement Liaison Committee have provided us with a draft set of national standards for mobile food businesses, which we will be consulting on later in this year. Last September, I attended a national standards meeting at COSLA, where local authority regulators discussed where it might be appropriate to introduce national standards to increase consistency. As a result of this, COSLA and local authorities are firstly assessing whether a more consistent and transparent approach to setting fees can be agreed in respect of civic and miscellaneous licensing, and secondly, streamlining the process, procedures and fees relating to food exports certificates. Now, neither of these two matters, I expect, are going to engage the public on the front page of newspapers. But that doesn't mean they're not important, because the level of fees, the need for consistency and so on is extremely important to business, especially small business, as Mike McKenzie articulated in his remarks. Presiding Officer, you've indicated that I've come to a close so early on in my remarks, which are considerably lengthier than I will have the opportunity to read out this afternoon. May I conclude by thanking everybody involved and commending the Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill to this House.
Many thanks for your brevity. And that concludes the debate on the Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill. And it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 8769 in the name of Derek Mackay and the Town Centre Action Plan. I'd invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now and call on Derek Mackay to speak to and move the motion up to 10 minutes. Minister, we are very, very tight.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Having launched Scotland's Town Centre Action Plan on behalf of the Scottish Government, I am particularly heartened that the Chair of the Cross-Party Group on Towns and Town Centres subsequently endorsed the plan and acknowledged that it had been largely well received. This is fair comment and reflects the partnership approach to supporting and revitalising our town centres. The action plan is clear, but is not an end in itself. It helps set the conditions for recovery and offers a range of actions appropriate to local circumstances. Town centres are important. They offer as a base for small business and local jobs. They support local economies and offer space for community and civic functions. Town centres give a town their identity and offer a sense of place for those who want to live, work and visit there. This Government recognises the importance of town centres. We met our commitment to carry out a national review of town centres. In July last year, we welcomed the review group's report, Community and Enterprise in Scotland's Town Centres. This report makes key recommendations to help support those town centres, and we are indebted to the Chair and the external advisory group members for the work that they have undertaken. The Government Action Plan is a response to their recommendations. I've spoken with key stakeholders across the wider public, private and community sectors during the production of our action plan and beyond. I've been encouraged by the existing initiatives already in place to support our town centres, and would also recognise that there are many more opportunities to take. That is why our action plan focuses on what we, as a government, can do to help town centres, but also asks that our partners work together to provide a joined-up approach to town centre regeneration. The review report has called for action, and this Government has listened. For the first time, we have an action plan in place that sets the framework for town centre regeneration. I have lead responsibility for implementing the plan and ensuring that momentum is maintained across Government to deliver the actions we have set out. In preparing the response to the recommendations set out in the review, I brought together senior officials from across Government who have a stake in the health of our towns. Together, we have identified the relevant policies, programmes and strategies which support and put in place the conditions to enable and promote local action. Of course.
Chip Brodie.
In the excellent document, in the action plan on empty properties, in Burn Statue Square in Ayr, in the town centre of Ayr, we have listed buildings which are in such a state of utter disrepair that they are causing major problems for neighbouring properties. The owners are now subject to an action raised with the Procurator Fiscal. Will the Government consider strengthening legislation and penalties, along with identifying better practice on such properties?
Minister.
I thank Mr Brodie for his question. There are a range of things we can do in terms of buildings that have been left in a terrible state of repair, and that's exactly why we'll take action through the proposed Community Empowerment Scotland Bill. There are also other factors to consider, such as the use of compulsory purchase orders and indeed the VAT issue, where it is ludicrous that the UK Government has taken a decision that VAT should be not given relief to town centre refurbishment as opposed to just new builds. So I do think there's an issue in financial incentivisation as well as legal and other actions, and we'll take forward that as a Scottish Government. But in terms of town centres, there's an issue about consolidation, growth and adaptation to circumstances and what has been quite a challenging time. And of course there's an issue around internet shopping, but therein lies an opportunity, not just a threat to town centres. For example, click and collect is one way forward. But the message is clear. By working together and putting our town centres to the fore, we can capture the opportunities to make them vibrant places for people to socialise, live in and do business in. Solving of the issues facing our towns is not solely the responsibility of central government. A great many people are involved in maintaining the health of Scottish towns, and I commend their work. This is an area where local solutions will be absolutely critical, but government should certainly remove any barriers identified. Our action plan is intended to add support to stimulate and encourage action across the wider public, private and community sectors, all of whom we have invited to contribute to our ongoing efforts. The review group made a specific call for a town centre first principle, a principle which would put town centres at the heart of the decision-making process. This principle would go beyond the existing sequential test in Scottish planning policy. The review group aspire to a town centre first principle which drives public sector investment decision-making, aligns policies and targets resources to put town centre sites first and encourages diversity and vibrancy. We broadly agree with this aspiration, and we are now establishing a working group with COSLA to determine how a town centre first principle would work and be interpreted in practice. This group includes, amongst others, representatives of Heads of Planning Scotland, Scottish Local Authority Economic Development, Scottish Futures Trust and Architecture and Design Scotland. This principle will see a fundamental shift in public policy. To demonstrate this, we have agreed to amplify guidance in the much-read Scottish Public Finance Manual to ensure that bodies acquiring and disposing of public sector assets and property consider the degree of priority attached to town centres. This shows the Scottish Government's commitment to leading the way in how the public sector responds to the town centre first principle. We have launched a £2 million demonstration town centre housing fund to bring empty town centre properties back into use. We subsequently increased this by £750,000 to bring the total to £2.75 million in support of the affordable housing projects as demonstration projects. Through this fund, we will test the barriers and opportunities to town centre living, as many of our town centres need to diversify. We announced the details of the 7 successful projects in Parliament on the 9th of January. Many initiatives will be implemented in the next few months, including the expansion of the Fresh Start Business Rates Relief Scheme to give 50% rates relief to businesses who take even more kinds of long-term empty properties. This includes more premises with higher values of up to £65,000 and additional types of empty premises, including those previously used as pubs, hotels and restaurants. We have targeted our mainstreaming charrettes grants specifically in support of our town centre charrettes, and a project team has been appointed to develop the master planning toolkit specific to town centres, highlighting good practice in design, accessibility and effective engagement with town centre communities. The National Review was explicit in terms of the need to create a longer-term model when it comes to making decisions about where local services are placed or where the focus should be on future town planning decisions. In direct continuation of this thought, we will work with Architecture and Design Scotland and the Scottish Future Trust to investigate ways of expanding the role of place-based reviews. We want to work with interested planning authorities to test new approaches for town centres. A recent consultation on draft Scottish Planning Policy, SPP, proposed a town centre health check to help inform the development plans and planning applications, the purpose of which would be to assess the strengths, weaknesses and resilience of a town centre, as well as gauge its vitality and viability. In addition to this, also in November, we launched a consultation on the Community Empowerment Scotland Bill. Community empowerment is about communities taking their own decisions about their futures and unlocking the immense local potential that we know exists. This bill will give people in communities and those supporting them in the public sector a range of new ways to deliver a better Scotland. The bill will make it easier for communities to take over public sector land and buildings, improve and extend the existing community right to buy. It will also create flexibility to deliver local-led business rate relief schemes as appropriate to local circumstances, in addition to our comprehensive national package of support in terms of business rates relief. Many of the solutions outlined in the original review report are not for the Scottish Government to undertake directly, but our action plan is meant as an added stimulus to encourage and support action across the wider public and private and community sectors, all of whom we invite to contribute to the efforts required ahead. And through this engagement, we will facilitate action to help address local issues faced by our town centres. We will continue to support a range of demonstration projects to test emerging ideas from the review report and action plan, and we plan to support this as a demonstration phase with the provision of new budget of £1.5 million in each of the financial years 14-15 and 15-16. And I would encourage all members to engage with local elected members and local partnerships, chambers of commerce, local businesses to come forward with ideas for demonstration projects that can help show the way to rejuvenate the town centres up and down and across Scotland. And I think it will be in that partnership approach that will assist us in delivering the action plan to support town centres which we know people care about, and we will now be able to put the mechanisms in place to ensure that they enjoy the sustainable economic growth and recovery that the country is now experiencing.
Excellent. Many thanks. Now calling Sarah Boyer. Up to 7 minutes, please.
I welcome this debate because it gives us a chance to focus on what action needs to be taken to enable our town centres to survive. It's only a short debate, so I want to use my time to focus on the issues that need more priority and investment. Last week, a leading retail expert warned that high streets could become zombies unless planning rules change to make it easier for cafes, restaurants and homes to move in where shops can no longer operate. But he highlighted his view that the top 50 UK high streets would get stronger. So the pace of change is accelerating, particularly in relation to online shopping, and it's not going to slow down. Just to give one example, in the New Year sales, online sales in John Lewis jumped by 34.5% compared with the same week last year, and that's a company already doing really well in online sales. So for all of us, I don't think there can be any room for complacency. And while there is much that we can agree with in terms of the ambition and analysis in the Malcolm Fraser report, there is so much more that the Government's action plan should have included for action. Our town centres need to be regenerated. Our local authorities need to work with businesses and local communities to develop strategies and action plans to save our town centres. Our town centres need to be interesting, attractive, they need a range of shops and services that we all want to use, and they need to be safe and they need to be accessible. So there's a lot that we need to do. I strongly support the principle of town centre first, but it has got to be applied consistently by the Scottish Government. We need every public service and leisure and cultural facility assessed in terms of its capacity in town centres, and that will bring the vitality and the dynamism that our town centres urgently need. That's why Labour MSPs have opposed the Scottish Government's court closure programme and proposal to reduce access or to close police station counters. In towns like Haddington and South Queensferry, people themselves have objected because they understand the negative impact those closures would have on reducing the vitality and the attractiveness of our town centres. But our amendment today focuses on the particular issue and the importance of enabling people to live in our town centres. And the aim of bringing people back into town centres through utilising land and buildings is massively desirable. It would certainly help shop workers faced with difficult journeys into towns when the buses don't start in time for their shift. It would be great for people working in businesses and public services, and it would be great for people who are attracted to the buzz that comes from living in town centres. And while support for businesses is crucial, we've also got to think about a package that will enable people to live in our town centres again and bring them to life. And the money allocated in the Town Centre Housing Fund is a drop in the ocean compared to what we need in our town centres. Only 7 town centres benefit, and our amendment is actually just stating the obvious. We need significantly more than the £2.75 million offered to get people back into our town centres. The fact the Minister had to push it up from £2 million with a relatively short timescale, I'm sure if he offered more money, we'd have had a whole host of more projects. So we need to do more. Then there's the issue about the role of our local authorities in bringing businesses, communities and agencies together. They have a vital role in developing projects on the ground to rescue and reshape our town centres, whether it's urban rail projects or putting together redevelopment packages where the market has simply walked away, and when owners are happy to have their properties empty for years at a time. So there are significant obstacles, and we all know that current councils are currently cash-strapped, so it's a difficult choice for them to allocate extra money into town centre management initiatives, and even more so to put money into capital investment to transform those buildings, the kind of run-down buildings that we've already heard about today. A key power that local authorities could do with would be a more streamlined compulsory purchase power. Will this be one of the powers that the Minister will include in the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill? I think that could be a really useful power. At the Built Environment Forum for Scotland conference last year, there was a showcase of some fantastic examples of local authority-led initiatives which have transformed town centres. Glasgow's use of property ownership to give access to young aspiring entrepreneurs and arts-based companies who needed a shop window was a really good example, and they supported that with business assistance for the first few years. Then there's the cooperative-owned companies, the kind of ideas that's in the amendment that I know that was suggested by the Greens. They work particularly well in smaller towns and rural communities where there's a strong community ethos. Now, I think there's a lot in the action plan. There's a lot of lists of things that need to be done. But having visited several town centres last summer to look at what's happening on the ground, I firmly believe that every town centre needs its own action plan, needs its own strategy, and it needs to be resourced and enabled with proper buy-in from key players. And I think the role of local authorities as the key civic leadership in pulling together local businesses, developing bids, pulling together the owners of businesses, and with the capacity to analyse which buildings could be brought together in project management, particularly to look at those buildings which are full of character but are poorly maintained. That's a role that I think local authorities are best placed to lead in, and that's why we need the capacity to get on with this. And that's why I think the action plan needs to be more ambitious. For example, we need better bus connections. We need better walking and cycling infrastructure. Can the Minister explain, for example, why walking and cycling are seen as long-term issues to be addressed? Spokes make the very obvious point that if we have better facilities and better access to our town centres, then that would lead to a more attractive opportunity. Yes. In
your last 45 seconds. Then.
To answer the very point, I agree absolutely with the member about local authorities. That's why we're waiting for the local authority response, because what I've published is the government's response. But you're absolutely right on the actions of local authorities that are required to be taken.
Sarah Boy, 30 seconds.
I thought the Minister might have come in on the cycling point, but there's always the summing up speech at the end. The pace of change is accelerating. We all know that, so we need greater sense of urgency in addressing these challenges. We focused on housing, getting people back into our town centres to live. That's a practical, it's a job that we could all do together. It needs more resource, and I therefore move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. And I now call on Gavin Brown. Up to 5 minutes, please, Mr Brown, to speak to and move your amendment.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Let me start by moving my amendment and by saying that town centres are critical. I'm sure that view will be shared right across the chamber, right across all of the political parties and right across the country. They play a key role in our economy, in creating jobs and in creating communities. And they face at the moment a multitude of challenges. Some of those are related to the downturn and the economic conditions over the last 5 or 6 years, but others are longer term, others are structural, and others are part of a far longer term trend that all of us have to accept some responsibility for. So I welcome the report that was produced by the External Advisory Group, and I have to say I give credit to the Government for setting up that group. The group did some very good work. It had, I think, quite an impressive list of people contributing to that group and sitting on it, and I think it is a basis from which we can move forward. I have to say, though, I was disappointed with the Scottish Government response to that report. I think they ducked some of the big issues. I think they ignored some of the more radical and interesting objectives within the report and commented and restricted themselves to some of the things they were already doing and some of the things that are easy to talk about as opposed to actually do. Let's look firstly at, I think, probably the principal first aim that comes forward at page 6 of the Expert Advisory Group report. This is the town centre's first principle. Their recommendation is this: the Scottish Government and all public sector bodies need to ensure that funding and investment programmes are aligned to achieve the maximum effect in supporting diversity, enterprise and creativity in our town centres. A strong statement. But as that statement came out last summer, what were the Scottish Government doing? They were busy shutting down courts right across the country. So we have a report talking about a town centre first principle, but we have the Scottish Government busy with a court closure programme. When the Scottish Government produces its response in November, they give a warm welcome, or at least a lukewarm welcome, to the town centre first principle. But what are they busy doing? Busy with a police counter closure programme right across the country. There is no point in this minister or the economic minister standing up and talking about how critical town centres are to our economy, when another wing of government, right at the same time, is taking action effectively to denigrate or to do down our town centres. That makes no sense whatsoever. If there is going to be this principle, it has to be joined up not just across the Scottish Government, but across the public sector as a whole in Scotland. Deputy Presiding Officer, there was another, I think, strong and radical policy within the expert group, and this was a business rates incentivisation scheme plus, as they call it in the report. They state that as business rates traditionally go to central government, this represents a new model of local authority incentivisation by having a business rates incentivisation scheme. The BRIS Plus scheme, which they suggest, would give local authorities 100% of additional business rates collected in town centres, as opposed to the 50% in the current Scottish Government policy. That has been Conservative policy since 2011, and I think it's something that the Government needs to respond to positively and give full consideration to it. Because we're very disappointed on this part of the Chamber with the current business rates incentivisation scheme, a scheme that was missing from the Minister's opening statement. I hope he comes to in his closing, because we were told this, Deputy Presiding Officer: any council that exceeds its annual business rates target will share the additional income equally with the Scottish Government. The scheme therefore incentivises councils to maximise their existing business rates income and to encourage or attract new economic growth, which will grow their business rates income further. The only problem, Deputy Presiding Officer, that this was said by the Scottish Government in 2011. This was their flagship policy going into the local authority elections in 2012. We now find ourselves in 2014, and what has happened with that policy? Well, in year one, the goalposts or the targets were changed at the last minute, where councils were in line to receive monies. Many of them now will receive nothing, and lots of them will receive far less than they intended to receive. And in year two, as we heard just last month, we haven't even set targets yet for the current financial year. We are 2 months away from the end of the financial year, and the councils haven't been given targets. That's why we're disappointed, Deputy Presiding Officer. I see you making those gestures, and I shall therefore leave it there. Thank you. Many thanks. And we now move to the open debate, and 4-minute speeches, please, or up to 4-minute speeches. Animal Ewing to be followed by Margaret McCulloch.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And as a member of the cross-party group on towns and town centres, I am pleased to be called to speak in this debate this afternoon. And what is quite clear from the debate is that the need to act to reinvigorate our town centres has indeed been widely acknowledged. And what is also quite clear, Presiding Officer, is that the Scottish Government has taken a lead here and has shown its determination to breathe new life into our town centres. And this can be seen by the fact that the Scottish Government commissioned in 2012 the National Review of Town Centres. And this review was indeed conducted by the leading architect Malcolm Fraser, and together with a panel of experts, and the group's recommendations were published in July last year. This in turn led to the Scottish Government's Town Centre Action Plan, published in response to the National Review recommendations, which action plan is of course the focus of our discussions today. And at the same time, Presiding Officer, what should also be highlighted, I believe, to show the Scottish Government's absolute commitment to town centres is the fact that in Scotland, for the first time, we have a government minister named as a dedicated minister for town centres. And this, I believe, serves to underline the change of government mindset, to quote from Malcolm Fraser when he commented on the Town Centre Action Plan. And I know that Derek Mackay, as the dedicated Minister for Town Centres, will strain every sinew to be Scotland's town centre champion. Presiding Officer, there's not sufficient time today to go into the action plan in great detail, but I would wish to mention the town centre first principle set forth in the plan. This approach, I believe, will be pivotal in making a success of the action plan, and therefore not just saving but in promoting our town centres. Across government, both local and national, it is vital that this presumption in favour of activity on our high streets is adhered to. And as the FSB has said, that this principle becomes a core factor of decision-making. And I believe it is incumbent, therefore, on all of us to monitor the application of this presumption across the public sector very carefully indeed to ensure that the obvious decline blighting many of our town centres is halted and indeed reversed. For I know that we would all want to see our town centres as vibrant places where people can shop, places where people can live, places where people can enjoy their leisure time, and places where people can access relevant services. And that is the challenge before us. And I do welcome the Scottish Government's commitment to work with COSLA to determine how the Town Centre First principle will indeed work in practice. I welcome too the Town Centre Housing Fund, which will help bring empty properties and town centres back into use for affordable housing, and I welcome the beneficiaries announced recently, including Cooper, Alva and Crieff as a member of this Parliament for Mid-Scotland and Fife. I also welcome the extension of the Fresh Start scheme in terms of the reduction in business rates being offered in those circumstances. Of course, Presiding Officer, the issue of business rates is crucial to ensuring that our high streets can survive in these very difficult financial times. And as someone who has actually run a small business, I understand very well what a lifeline the small business bonus scheme has been. And indeed, in Fife alone, 5,800 businesses have benefited from the small business bonus scheme since the policy was introduced by this SNP government in 2008, saving therefore some £45.7 million for Fife businesses. But why on earth, I would have to ask in conclusion, has the Labour Party got the small business bonus scheme in its sights? Why do they want Fife businesses to pay higher rates than businesses south of the border? And why do they advocate pulling the rug from Fife businesses who are struggling to make ends meet day and daily? People in Fife know that the small business bonus scheme is safe with the SNP. It is a pity that they cannot rely on the representatives in the Labour Party to confirm their commitment to small business. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. Now call on Margaret McCulloch to be followed by Bob Doris, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As convener of the cross-party group in towns and town centres, I am very keen to see the future of our town centres pushed up the political agenda, and so I welcome this afternoon's debate. I would also join with colleagues in welcoming both the broad aims of the Town Centre Action Plan and the work of Malcolm Fraser and his external advisory group, which has informed so much of the Government's thinking on town centres. Many of the ideas coming out of both the review and the action plan are sound and have received broad support: mixed-use town centres, digital towns, community enterprise and regeneration. But what I have learned from the Fraser Review and from my own experience through the cross-party group is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to town centres regeneration. Solutions from a hometown of East Kilbride, a new town with a big retail-focused town centre, will be different from Hamilton down the road, which has adopted the Business Improvement District model. This point is crucial because BIDS, ATCM, Development Trust Scotland and Scotland's Towns Partnership will all tell you that towns have to develop their own USP to be resilient in an economy that is increasingly dominated by online sales and out-of-town retail. There are three specific points I want to make in relation to the content of the action plan. Firstly, on business rates, despite claims to the contrary, Labour remains committed to the uniform business rates and the small business bonus, although we believe the latter could have been targeted in a smarter, sharper way. Labour argued for greater flexibility in rates to incentivise growth at the local level, and so I am personally very interested in proposals around incentivisation in the action plan. However, there are recurrent issues that are coming up time and time again. Not only are town centre traders telling us that the valuations are out of kilter with the property market, but the process of appealing an assessor's decision is time-consuming, convoluted and sometimes just impenetrable for local firms. Secondly, on town centre living, I want to bring Paisley to the attention of the Chamber. The cross-party group visited a number of Renfrewshire towns in our study visit last year. Paisley was very interesting because the vision the bid has set out for that town is not just about retail. It's about people living and socialising in the town centre. The Town Centre Housing Fund is welcome, but it has to be part of a wider strategy for the regeneration of our towns. Let's also be clear that it's a drop in the ocean in terms of meeting housing needs in Scotland. And the final point I would make is on the Town Centre First principle. As previously said by Gavin Brown, it's a good principle, but it would be helpful if Police Scotland, the Scottish Court Service and Post Office Limited also recognised the Town Centre First principle. However, I noticed from parliamentary answers that no definition of what Town Centre First actually means yet has actually yet been agreed by Scottish Government and COSLA. The truest criticism of an otherwise welcome action plan is that many of the points contained within it will take time to implement, and that's time that some businesses just don't have. For example, I would anticipate that the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill is going to become a very important bill for anyone interested in regenerating our town centres, but the consultation period hasn't even closed yet. Presiding Officer, I wish the Minister well in putting this plan into practice. I would simply conclude by impressing upon him the urgency of measures to make Scotland's towns more resilient and more attractive, even in these testing times. Thank you.
Thank you. Now call on Bob Doris to be followed by Dr Lane Murray.
Presiding Officer, Glasgow has many town centres very distinct from its city centre, and fleshing out what a town centre first principle means in practice, let us ensure Glasgow and other city-based town centres are at the heart of measures to support Scotland's town centres. And I am confident that will happen. Following my intervention, the Scottish Government's Town Centre Regeneration Fund included city-based town centres, and my city of Glasgow gained over £5 million, including £1.8 million for Maryhill Borough Halls, a wonderful asset to the constituents that I represent. However, there are less desirable businesses trading on our high streets, and any town centre action plan, I would like to think, could deal with them. So-called payday lenders offering instant cash to vulnerable Scots at exorbitant interest rates. They add nothing to our city centres or town centres, except perhaps, on occasions, misery. They target families who are most desperate for cash, offering apparent solutions that only push vulnerable people further into debt. We know this is a huge and growing problem. Citizens Advice Scotland are having 100 people present themselves every single week to them, contacting them with debt problems linked to payday lending. I have no doubt that UK welfare cuts to our most needy will be linked to the growth in this area, but that's perhaps a debate for another day, Presiding Officer. It is no accident that payday lending shops locate themselves very often beside communities that are often struggling the most financially. I do not believe it is right, acceptable or ethical that someone struggling financially can walk into an instant cash shop and borrow money at nearly 4,000% APR. I checked just today. Such rip-off rates are available right now. Walk into Maryhill Shopping Centre, walk into Springburn Shopping Centre, walk down Brotherglen Main Street. In fact, right across Scotland. Presiding Officer, short of independence, we cannot tackle such unsavoury and undesirable lending practices on our high streets as directly as we wish to see. But yet again, that is an argument for another day. However, this Parliament, in partnership with our local authorities, must do all we can to rid our town centres of these outlets, whether it is using planning, whether it is using licensing, or whether it is using taxation powers at our disposal. Whatever mechanism, perhaps another mechanism, we must use every tool at our disposal to ensure that our town centres do not promote such practices. Presiding Officer, I would ask the Minister, I would call on the Minister to convene a summit to coordinate efforts to clamp down on such payday lending practices on our high street. I genuinely believe that together we can get a clear consensus that shops offering 4,000% loans to those most in debt have no place at the heart of our high streets. And together, I believe we can find a way to take action to tackle this scurrilous problem. Presiding Officer, thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you for your brevity. I now include Dr Elaine Murray, to be followed by Jamie Hepburn.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officers. I too welcome the work undertaken by Malcolm Fraser and the National Town Centre Review External Advisory Group and its recommendations and key actions. It notes, for example, the need for work with housing providers in the private and public sectors to bring empty town centre properties, such as those over shops, back into use for affordable housing. It recommends that local authorities recognise the importance of bringing residential footfall back into town centres and prioritise appropriate sites for town centre housing development within their local housing strategies, but more of that later. I want to talk about Dumfries, the regional capital of Dumfries and Galloway. It has some fine historic buildings, some of which have sadly fallen into disrepair. The town centre has, like many others, faced significant challenges in recent years through the changes in patterns of retail demand, the town's proximity to other major retail centres, such as Carlisle, and to a lesser extent Glasgow and Newcastle, the expansion of out-of-town retail centres along the A75, and, of course, the rapid growth in internet shopping. The recession added further problems as a number of retail chains with shops in the high street went into administration. And in addition, many of our older town centre retail properties not situated in the actual high street are smaller. There's older buildings for which there has been little demand in recent years, and some indeed have changed their type of occupation because of that. Dumfries and Galloway Council has developed a number of projects to improve the public realm, including the flood prevention proposals which I raised last week with the Environment Minister, who's in the Chamber at the moment. Charitable organisations such as the Moatbrae Trust, which is working on the refurbishment of the almost derelict townhouse, whose garden inspired J.M. Barrie to write Peter Pan, with a view of creating a children's museum, and the work being undertaken by the Theatre Royal Trust to regenerate Scotland's oldest working theatre. These will also make outstanding contributions to the town's future and to its tourism offering. However, it is disappointing, therefore, particularly in the light of the Task Force's key recommendation on bringing empty properties, such as those over shops, into residential use for affordable housing, that the Scottish Government rejected Dumfries and Galloway Council's recent bid to the Town Centre Housing Fund. The bid's title, Dumfries Living Over the Shops, reflected, I think, the key recommendation that I referred to earlier. It involved partnership between 3 private sector owners on 3 refurbishment projects to provide much-needed affordable housing and high-quality commercial space. It would have provided 7 new flats over commercial units in the town centre to be let at mid-market rent, 4 new commercial units suitable for local independent traders, and 1 improved commercial unit. These properties would have been available for affordable housing. Briefly, thank you. I've only got a minute.
The member advocates for our local area. I would expect her to do that, but I wouldn't accept that these demonstration projects is the limit of the government's ambition. There may be a way to take forward such a project without this specific fund in this instance.
Dr Murray.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for that, because I believe this is a very good project. It is in line with the Government's own mid-market rent property strategy, and it also has planning consent for refurbishment of 2 of the sites, and the 3rd is actually expected to be consented by March this year. If that bid had been successful, they could have started construction in March and completed by October. There's a lot to like about these proposals, and I am encouraged to hear that there are other, and I would like to hear more about other proposals or other sources of funding, because at the moment the 7 which were successful actually are RSLs and local councils refurbishing existing properties for which they already get affordable housing supply funding. And at the moment, it looks a wee bit like that this funding is being used to supplement funding for affordable housing, which comes through other sources. So I don't have any wish to denigrate the current proposals, but I think at the moment there's been a missed opportunity to support a really innovative project. Minister, if you're still interested in this project, I look forward to hearing more about how it can be funded, and I hope I'll hear about that pretty soon. Thank you.
And thank you. Now calling Jamie Hepburn, to be followed by Alison Johnson.
Thank you very much, President Officer. And as Elaine Murray did, I want to talk about the Town Centre Action Plan in the context of the local experience of my own constituency. And as with most members, indeed I would hope all members, I'm very proud to represent the area I do. I'm very proud to represent the towns of Cumbernauld and Kilsyth. They are two great towns with a lot going for them. They have a strong civic identity, they have strong community spirit, they have lots of green space in and around them for people to enjoy. They're well located, well connected to the rest of the country. They have great schools, they provide a great standard of living. But one area of concern has been and continues to be the condition of the town centres in these towns, perhaps less so in Kilsyth, where there have been efforts at renovation supported by the Town Centre Regeneration Fund that the Government established in the last parliamentary session. But I think the situation at Cumbernauld Town Centre is probably well known. It's probably well known to most members in here. I think it's well known across the country, where we have a town centre that probably holds the town back a little to some degree and reflects on the whole town rather unfairly. We certainly do not have a town centre that matches the civic pride that people in Cumbernauld have in their town. And one of the big problems we have at Cumbernauld Town Centre is that it is, unlike most town centres, it is privately owned, unlike Kilsyth, where the High Street is, of course, public property. The council can act in ways in which it can't at Cumbernauld Town Centre. And I should say, to be fair, there are new owners at the oldest part of Cumbernauld Town Centre, and they have, I believe, plans to renovate the town centre, which I look forward to seeing emerge. So any town centre action plan that can help Cumbernauld and other town centres is very much to be welcome. I think the Government is to be congratulated for its plan, which is, of course, as the Minister said, the first of its kind in Scotland. And I think the Town Centre Housing Fund, the Town Centre Investment Zones, the extension of the Fresh Start scheme, the money that's been provided for a town centre chariots are all examples of innovative approaches to reinvigorating town centres that I, and I'm sure all members, very much welcome. I hear some concern about the levels of funding for some of these areas, but I think the fact that they've been put in place should be welcomed by all members. I want to conclude, though, President Officer, talking about the one area that I didn't mention that's set out in the Town Centre Action Plan, talking about the Town Centre First principle. Let me say I very much agree broadly with this principle, and it's not, I suppose, that different from existing principles for retail. But I would hope we can be clear, and the Minister can perhaps respond, that it isn't a hard and fast, absolute rule stopping development out with the town centre entirely, because although it's a principle that will be very applicable in most cases, and indeed if I think of Kilsyth within my constituency, it's a town of 10,000 with a concentrated population very close to the town centre. It's very applicable there. Cumbernauld is a much bigger town of 50,000 people, and some people live quite far away from the town centre, so in those cases clearly development out with the town centre, although development in the town centre is very much needed, but development elsewhere is still appropriate. So I look forward to seeing what emerges from the discussions with COSLA in that regard, and I also look forward to seeing this action plan being rolled out further and reinvigorating, hopefully, Cumbernauld and Kilsyth town centres and town centres across the country. Thank you very much, President Officer.
Thank you. Now call on Alison Johnson. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Town Centre First principle, putting the health of town centres at the heart of a thriving local economy, is very welcome. I find it strange that we thought differently in the past. Strange that we thought that making anything other than the town centre the most important place for people to shop, meet, socialise and enjoy was a good idea. I'm pleased too that we've recognised that the town centres can't only be about retail, important as this may be, and I'll come back to retail in a moment. The world has changed, and we shouldn't strive to have the town centres of the past. A good mix of places to live, places to eat, places to work and to shop make the town centre attractive. Housing is a key part of the future, but it needs a change in attitude in public bodies. In my region, the Old Town of Edinburgh Community Council recently folded after years and years of feeling that the development of the city centre wasn't about the people who live there, despite their strenuous efforts to try to make it so. Private rented housing is prevalent in city centres and on high streets, And if we want to attract people back there, it's important that tenants' rights are strengthened and privately renting tenants get a good deal in the new housing bill. And convenience is essential. The convenience of online retail offers an opportunity for town centre retailers. So we could try to support local retailers to get online to enable them to compete with the big retailers offering click and collect. Make it the norm to order some food from the local butcher and greengrocer, online during the office lunch break and collect it on your way home from work. And walking and cycling access to town centres should be given more priority, and I've written to the Minister on behalf of the cross-party group on cycling. As Sarah Boyack said, walking and cycling is the only action the government deems long-term when it should be designed in from the start of any improvements. And our train and bus stations need to be welcome. They need to encourage people into town centres with clear walking routes to shops, cafes. Existing out-of-town shopping centres could be seen as park and ride facilities to help connect more people with the town centre, and micro-businesses could be supported in town centres with hubs with advice and hot desks. The amendment I lodged for today's debate talked about local taxation. Devolution is important, but not just from Westminster to Holyrood. The real value in devolution of power is from Holyrood to our local councils who can decide on local solutions. Local authorities should be able to decide the right balance of different taxes to meet their social, environmental and economic needs in line with the priorities of local voters. Local councillors may decide that their local economies would be bolstered by local sourcing, extension of the living wage or increased employee participation, and they should have the ability to promote them. The business rates incentivisation scheme exists, but it's the poor cousin of true local taxation that creates genuine economic incentives for local investment in new high-quality employment. As Sarah Boyack and Margaret McCulloch noted, one size doesn't fit all. The needs of the High Street in Edinburgh are different from those in Bathgate, Livingston or Linlithgow. Councils are better placed to understand this and should be able to design a business rates regime that works for them, and we need to have the confidence to let them do so. Thank you.
Thank you. And we now move to the closing speeches, and I call on Mr Cameron Buchanan, 4 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. A number of speeches this afternoon have highlighted the importance of our local businesses to our town centre. As my colleague Gavin Brown made clear, the Scottish Government must do more in terms of both rates relief, and we must have concrete progress on the business rate incentivisation. We need a healthy environment for small businesses to thrive, not only to encourage start-ups, though important, but also to support businesses that are already trading. I say this because for many people the objective is not simply to attract and sustain businesses, but to achieve a mix of different shops and services. I was interested to note in the context of the Porter's Review in England, there was particular attention paid to the highest proportion of betting shops in our community, which has already been raised, particularly in deprived areas. At the same time, a Competition Commission report found in 2008 a very significant decline in the old staples of the high street, including independent grocers, bakers and butchers. People complain to me every time that they all say that high streets look the same. Go to a small town in America, for example, or in Italy, and you'll see local shops, not chains, run by local people. Variety is the key word here. We can't legislate, but we can encourage. And this is an important point, Deputy Presiding Officer, not merely for cosmetic reasons, but because choice and quality products and services are the key to attracting people in the high street. There is broad agreement that our town centres are losing out to out-of-town developments and large supermarkets. Accordingly, it is crucial that we create a level playing field and give small businesses the means to compete, not only providing local employment, but giving consumers a genuine choice when it comes to their shopping. For this to happen, not only do we need a competitive business rates regime, but we also need to provide facilities to draw people back into town centres. And that means in park and ride as well. In that respect, I do welcome the movement towards planning towards presumption in favour of town centres. Again, we must give local authorities the means to breathe life back into our high streets, and flexibility within the planning system is crucial in this respect. However, we need more than just planning reform to deliver much-needed town centre facilities. When you speak to people about the reasons they don't visit their local high street at present, one of the key reasons is often cited is the difficulties in getting there. And whilst we must encourage sustainable transport where possible, including park and ride, the lack of parking facilities in many town centres is a big issue. Even for 5 minutes to stop and pick up something, as Alison Johnson said, if you're going to go to online and you're going to pick something up at lunchtime or something, you do need to get into the town. And this is why out-of-town centres are often so attractive in comparison. To deliver that sort of change, we need to provide financial resources. And again, following on with my colleague Gavin Brown, I think it's regrettable that we're not coming up with funding to provide these much-needed facilities, whether it be for parking or make it easy for people to travel via public transport. I come again to this level playing field point. We must make it just as easy and just as attractive to go to the high street as to the nearest retail park. A point I hope our centre guru here can take on board. Town centre guru, I should say. Presiding officer, there's a great deal that can be done to support our town centres, but the government must start by taking action on business rates and giving local businesses a fighting chance. I know we can't legislate to stop every high street having the same multiples, but we can stop certain shops proliferating. You cannot stop payday lenders opening a shop, but we can legislate against too many of them opening. The same with betting shops, which has already been mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Sarah Boyack. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Although this has been a brief debate, I do actually think it's been a good debate in terms of lots of practical ideas, in terms of real town centres across the country, and I think also some very constructive criticism of the Government's town centre plan. And the challenges of bringing regeneration to our town centres are not going to go away. The challenge of competing with out-of-town retail parks is going to continue, and I thought that the points made by Elaine Murray were absolutely spot on. And I think one of the challenges for the Minister is to think about his role as a champion for town centres in relation to making the town centre first principle real and being applied across government and the public sector. I think is looking at his planning powers, and I think there's an interesting challenge to be thought about there, because I know the Minister is keen to devolve planning decisions and not take a strong role from central government, but I do think there's a balancing act in terms of the guidelines and his power to call in major planning applications. So I just leave that with him as a thought, because there's a real issue there about how he exercises those powers. I think several members commented very effectively that the challenges of town centres are also relevant in our cities and villages too, although the scales are different. And I think one of the things that we need to learn is from best practice. If you look at Edinburgh's George Street, for example, it is not successful by accident. The council invested a lot of time and money and resource to develop a strategy to attract the right sort of retailers to make it work, and they did a lot of work for the business community. So I thought the points that were made by Bob Doris and Alison Johnson were absolutely right about thinking about town centres, both in individual towns, but also the town centres in our cities too. They also need particular strategies. Several members mentioned the cost of living crisis and the real impact it's having on retailing and people's capacity to spend. And it's interesting that even those retailers which discounted heavily in the run-up to Christmas reported an incredibly tough retailing climate. And before Christmas and the New Year period is their best time to get people into the shops. So I think those challenges are going to continue, and particularly those town centres caught in a spiral of decline, with retailers struggling to keep up with the pace of change. They need practical help, because the transition and the pace of change is just beyond the capacity of lots of smaller retailers. We've now got new types of retailing. We've got third-party traders who work with other retailers online. Now, the technological skills, the business strategy skills are not necessarily going to be held in small companies. And I thought the points that were made by colleagues about the need to target support for businesses, Margaret McCulloch's points, Margaret McDougall's points were Margaret McCulloch's points were absolutely bang on about using the small business bonus scheme and targeting support for those small businesses. They need support in terms of training, and they need access to business advice that they are not easily going to get. I think the points made both by Gavin Brown and by Margaret McCulloch about the reality of the business rates incentive scheme were absolutely bang on. There was a pot of money that local authorities thought in good faith was going to come to them. And those council leaders that I've spoken to have been bitterly disappointed about how that's actually worked out in practice. When the Scottish Government announces a scheme, they've got to follow it through, and withdrawing it after they've offered that incentive has led to a lot of real problems in our communities. One or two people mentioned the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill. There's the issue of compulsory purchase orders, which I mentioned in my opening speech, but there's lots and lots of other opportunities that can come from greater community involvement in our town centres. Community ownership, opportunities for social enterprises, opportunities for co-ops, and cultural initiatives that are community-led, that are bottom-up initiatives to locate in town centres alongside cafes and, crucially, new housing properties. All of those could help turn round and revitalise our town centres. There are lots and lots of good initiatives. Jane Baxter wanted to be in this debate today, but she knew it was short in terms of numbers. But she told me about the Night and Day Challenge Fund that they are looking at in Cowdenbeath. And what I found interesting was it's targeting young people, to ask young people, what do you think about the town centre for the future? Because we need to actually bring that next generation involved and not make assumptions about how they will use town centres. If you look at some of the research in terms of online, it's changing by almost the day. People are now using tablets and smartphones. It's not just a question of people going home at night and using their computers. People are sitting on buses and using their smartphones and tablets and ordering things up. Now, on one level, that's fantastic, but the pace of change is hard to cope with. And I think for small retailers and producers, access to better advice and access to knowledge about how they can develop their strategy could be hugely important. Now, we do now have a champion for small towns. There's a lot the Minister needs to do to use his capacity for leadership. What research capacity could he put in place? Well, monitoring the impact of the raft of business support that's available, we don't think that's done consistently, and we think there's more that could be done. For example, what's happened in terms of the legislation we passed last year on empty properties? At the time, we discussed whether it would be effective. What research has the Minister put in place? What have councils done in terms of using powers in relation to housing in town centres? How is he pulling together the innovation opportunities that have come through business investment? Picking up the ideas that came with the FSB report that they've put in front of us today. And I would like a particular focus on training. That's a real opportunity. And if you tie it into town centre investment for housing, there are some real win-wins available. But it's got to be targeted, the research needs to be there, and then the research needs to drive Scottish Government policy. On Tuesday, we debated climate change. Yesterday we debated health, and if the Scottish Government is serious about its target for 10% of all trips to be taken by bike within the next 6 years, then town centres are absolutely critical to that process. So it needs joined-up government thinking, and promoting town and city centres potentially helps address our wider policy ambitions on public health, on community involvement and ownership, and on economic regeneration for our communities. But we've got to link it in with local businesses and entrepreneurs as well. We need to focus on the needs and the opportunities. It's in the Minister's grasp to use his leadership to do more. And we were totally disappointed at the scale of the Boxing Day Christmas present. It was just too modest. I'm sure the Minister knows it didn't go far enough. But on top of slashing the capital budget for housing by 29%, there's been a real missed opportunity in housing in town centres. And I hope in his summing up speech, the Minister will talk about what more can be done. This has been a constructive debate, constructive criticism. I hope we'll get some constructive answers. Thank you very much.
And thank you. Now call the Minister, Derek Mackay. Minister, you have until 5 o'clock.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I begin, following on from where Sarah Boyack left off, saying modesty is my middle name, but I'm delighted that in this debate, Parliament has elevated my position in terms of town centre responsibility. I knew I had a job on my hands to deliver the action plan and ensure it's consistent. And we support town centres across Scotland. But my new title is Town Centre Champion, so I'll inform the Minister for Parliamentary Business that that's the case from this afternoon's constructive discussion. I actually think it's been a very good debate where a number of ideas have been raised, and I think these kind of ideas will feature as the work is ongoing, because I have never said that the action plan is a document that will go on the shelf and is an end in itself. It was the beginning of a debate and a process around what tools we can deploy to support town centres across the country. And I think our response is as concise as the external advisory group's report in focusing on particular themes. And that is to be welcomed, because we could all have regurgitated many words to talk about actions we might want to deploy, but we're focused on a very specific action plan that outlines what we intend to do. And there is a challenge to other partners and how they respond as well, and not just in the public sector, but the private sector as how they support local schemes, for example, loyalty cards at a local level or participate in the digital revolution. But on the particular themes we've outlined, we will put a great deal of emphasis on town centre living, on vibrant local economies, enterprising communities to develop that entrepreneurial spirit that we know exists across the country, and yes, so too with young people in particular. Accessible public services, the focus on digital towns and proactive planning as we've discussed. I know a number of members wanted to speak this afternoon and have not been able to do so, including George Adam from Paisley, who will be delighted that Margaret McCulloch mentioned Paisley in her speech as an example of a can-do town, proud past, promising future. And that kind of branding is only too relevant where local communities, as Dr Elaine Smith covered, focuses on the local branding. The local branding, get that right, in terms of the USP for our community, and particularly the Borders towns have done well in establishing a niche market and focusing on that. Margaret McCulloch is also right in terms of finding local solutions to the challenges faced by individual communities. It will never be a one-size-fits-all approach to our town centres, as we ensure that the package of support is there for each town centre to find its place and promote its place within our nation. And I think that's particularly why I would welcome the development of charrettes, which I've said before is not a French band, but which is a planning methodology that engages people in real time to produce a real action plan that can deliver a kind of practical and pragmatic vision for communities. And that's why we're now directing an emphasis to town centres. So too, to deliver our telecommunications strategy, I will shortly launch a consultation on, yes, a more liberal and permissive regime in terms of consents for telecommunications apparatus to ensure that all parts of Scotland can benefit from the digital revolution that we are currently a part of. And in terms of advice and support for businesses, absolutely, we want to make sure that that's available. But turning to Gavin Brown, I thought it was a pretty negative contribution all in all, because the member is well aware that the nature of the business rates incentivisation scheme is such that the deployment of new targets is not a decision by Scottish Government, but a decision at COSLA, who want to audit their own figures before we arrive at new target figures. We have not moved the goalposts. We have analysed the business rates take, appeals and other factors to arrive at a position, of course.
Gavin Brown. He says they didn't move the goalposts. Is he saying then that the targets that were set for 12-13 were not changed at all?
The same rules that apply and were deployed in the business rates incentivisation scheme are the same rules we are abiding by. What has changed is the impact of appeals on the figures, and that is a significant material change, and therefore we are perfectly entitled to take those figures into account. So why would we replicate in BRIS Plus a scheme which has some current deficiencies that we want to ensure is ironed out? But he mentions the reaction of the external advisory group, and I'm only too happy to quote Malcolm Fraser, who said of the government's response in terms of the Town Centre Action Plan, his words, not mine, "I'm impressed at the government's determination to promote a new town-centred culture across its policy-making and decision-taking. Next is for local authorities to embrace the challenges and opportunities this brings, and for our business and communities to be encouraged and enabled." I think we would all agree in this chamber that it is for others to consider their response to the external advisory group's findings so that we can move forward in partnership. Both Sarah Boyack and Alison Johnston mentioned the issue of accessibility in our town centres, and I think this is fair enough and focused on cycling, so the Government will give that further thought in our deliberations as to how we may take that forward. And at a recent cycling meeting, I know that 4 ministers were represented, and we will give that, as I say, further thought. What I will absolutely commit to is that very serious request from Bob Doris and how we tackle the issue of some businesses that maybe we don't want to see too much more of on our high streets, be it gambling premises or payday loan providers. And I will therefore convene a summit that will look at the planning, licensing and any other functions and good practice that exist, be it local government or elsewhere, to clamp down on those kind of properties. And I will do so on a cross-party basis, pulling in interests such as Kezia Dugdale, who has raised this before. And I think that is right to create the kind of diversity that our local communities want in our town centres. To answer Jamie Hepburn's point around how the policy applies, of course it is not, in terms of town centre first policy, a barrier to development, a barrier to growth. It is the extension of the sequential approach where you apply a methodology to ensure that if development is taking place, can it take place in a town centre first? And if it can't, you then look elsewhere for that kind of development. So it is about enabling economic growth whilst considering issues of net growth and displacement. I was asked why the Community Empowerment Scotland Bill is taking so long. We intend to consult on it comprehensively, because if there is one bill you want to get right and engage fully on, surely it is the Community Empowerment Bill, and that is why we're having a very exhaustive consultation process to ensure that we get it right. Town centres are important to Scotland, and I know that the FSB and other private sector organisations have impressed upon this government the importance of the small business bonus and a competitive rates regime in Scotland. And that is why I am at a loss as to why the Labour Party have opposed their actions on matching the poundage south of the border, have opposed their actions on the Fresh Start initiative to incentivise people to open premises, opposed their actions on empty property rates relief. In fact, the Labour Party would rather compensate people to keep premises closed than to open them to rejuvenate the town centres of Scotland. And that, of course,
I think you'll find, if you look through your books, that it was Jack McConnell who introduced a competitive business regime so that businesses in Scotland were not worse off than those in England. Minister. 2005.
Apart from the poundage being higher for many years that the Labour Party was office compared to the SNP government, Jack McConnell is not here, but other members of the Labour Party are, who have said they would sacrifice the small business bonus to pay for other policies now supported by the Labour Party. It is the package of business rates relief, the extension of the Fresh Start, the delivery of New Start, being copied, as I say, south of the border, the matching of the poundage and the small business that gives so much relief that I think has been a godsend to town centres across this country. And through our external advisory group analysis, through our action plan, I am convinced that the very proactive actions we will take, the partnership approach we have deployed, our decisions around budgets and the general enthusiasm we will bring to rejuvenating our town centres will ensure that the conditions are set so that our town centres will enjoy the economic recovery that has been experienced in so many parts by the actions of this government and others in the face of a reckless Labour Party who have produced no budget options to support our town centres. But I will leave with the conclusion now, Minister, that when it came to ideas, Labour had some. When it came to budget decisions, you had none. And sacrificing the town centres by abandoning your rates package, I think, is a big mistake on the part of the Labour Party.
And that concludes the debate on the Town Centre Action Plan, and it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is decision time, and there are 4 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that motion 8745, in the name of Fergus Ewing, on the Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are not agreed. There will therefore be a division. Please cast your votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 8745 in the name of Fergus Ewing is yes 93, no 2, and there was 1 abstention. The motion is therefore agreed. The next question is that Amendment 8769.2 in the name of Sarah Boyack, which seeks to amend motion number 8769 in the name of Derek Mackay on Town Centre Action Plan, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. Will there therefore be a division? Please cast your votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 8769.2 in the name of Sarah Boyack is yes 22, no 74. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The third question is that amendment 8769.3 in the name of Gavin Brown, which seeks to amend motion number 8769 in the name of Derek Mackay on the Town Centre Action Plan, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. Please cast your votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 8769.3 in the name of Gavin Brown is yes 10, no 86. There were no abstentions, and the amendment is therefore not agreed. The fourth question is that motion 8769 in the name of Derek Mackay on the Town Centre Action Plan be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are not agreed. There will be a vote. Please cast your votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 8769 in the name of Derek Mackay is yes 79, no 15. There were no abstentions, and the motion is therefore agreed. And that concludes decision time, and I now close this meeting of Parliament.